That the chair be authorized to declare recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearings and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, please keep your microphone muted unless speaking. Should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I will request that the member please mute their microphone. To insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. Where's my opening statement? I can't find my opening statement. Okay. Good morning. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today to share their testimony and expertise. I would also like to thank the ranking member, Mr. Crawford, for his commitment to making freight and rail safety the safest way to ship goods. The safety of the rail industry remains one of the most important issues facing this subcommittee, and it is why we included several safety provisions in the INVEST Act. Today, we will hear two panels with unique insight into safe operations of the freight rail system. First, we will hear from Amit Bose, the administrator of the Federal Rail Administration, whose primary role is ensuring safety of our nation's railroads. He'll be joined by Tom Chapman, a member of the National Transportation Safety Board, which investigates significant railroad accidents and recommends ways on preventing future ones. These two agencies play distinct roles in ensuring the safety of freight rail and protecting the workers and surrounding communities from rail accidents. Our second panel will be an opportunity to hear from representatives of the workers, the railroads, who confront these safety issues every day. The NTSB's 21-22 Most Wanted list of transportation safety improvements includes a call to improve safety for rail workers. Their recommendations speak to recurring safety issues impacting rail workers. These include better track protection, proper training, and job briefings and access to protective equipment. Most importantly, it calls for work schedules and limitations to prevent workers from working overtime while fatigued. Railway worker fatigue is one of the most persistent and pressing issues facing our national transportation system. It is a condition we've known about for years, but have not solved. Just last week, the FRA took a major step to address this with their final fatigue risk management rule, and I look forward to hearing more about that from our witnesses today. The freight rail industry has lost nearly a third of its workforce in the past 8 years. The workers who remain report that they are being worked harder with longer and more unpredictable hours. They say these conditions are worsening fatigue and making an industry that's inherently demanding even tougher to work for. Cutting labor costs may have made Wall Street happy, but it's left our national rail system more rigid and less able to respond to the ongoing supply chain shocks. The increased pressures on rail workers have made it harder for railroads to retain workers or recall them from furlough. It takes several months to fully train a rail crew. These trainings cannot be rushed as we seek to fill vacancies created when the railroads laid off workers, both before and during the COVID-19 pandemic. Not having enough rail workers isn't just a problem with the lack of conductors and engineers, it is across the freight rail industry. This includes the carmen who inspect and repair rail cars and maintenance of the way workers who build, inspect, maintain, and repair track, bridges, and rights-of-way. We are pleased that these workers are represented here today, and we look forward to hearing their testimony. It is through the diligent work of every actor in the rail space, rail workers, railroads, and regulators, that freight rail has made significant strides to move goods safely across this nation. There has been, however, a plateauing of safety improvements in recent years, and the Class I railroads' adoption of PSR has added new complications. This is why this committee is concerned. We are concerned that the recent attempts to reduce short-term costs have had a negative impact on safety practices and the historically proud railroad safety culture. And today's hearing is intended to consider some of these current issues. I would like again to thank all the witnesses for joining us today, and I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Crawford, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing today, and I thank our witnesses for participating as well. This hearing continues this subcommittee's focus on important aspects of railroad industry safety. Today, we're specifically focusing on safety issues in the freight rail industry. America's freight rail ranks as one of the safest means of transporting goods in the world. According to the Association of American Railroads, train accidents were down 33% between the years 2000 and 2020, and accidents involving hazardous materials were down 60%. These gains in safety build towards the ultimate target of zero accidents. Monitoring and protecting our 140,000-mile freight rail network is no easy job. Improving highway rail grade crossing protections, reducing human error, and supporting innovative new drone and automated safety technologies can all contribute toward reaching the zero accident goal. Specifically, we must continue to encourage the development of automated track inspection safety technology, which has been shown to decrease accidents, identify new safety issues, and free up safety inspectors to focus on other important duties. I recently sent a letter to Federal Railroad Administration raising concerns about its denials of waivers to continue testing automated track inspection technology. I ask for unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And finally, there are multiple federal grant programs that can help communities and railroads upgrade and improve their tracks, highway rail, grade crossings, and general network infrastructure in ways that can have dramatic impacts on safety. We must ensure that this grant funding is open and accessible to all qualified applicants in need, and that the money is distributed in a fair and transparent manner, including to both rural and urban areas. I commend the chair for holding this hearing today, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.
Nope, he's not here.
Okay, I guess we can move forward. I would like to now welcome our witnesses for the first panel. The Honorable Amit Bose, Administrator, Federal Railroad Administration. We have then the Honorable Thomas B. Chapman, member of the National Transportation Safety Board. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Administrator Bose, you may proceed.
Chairman Payne, Ranking Member Crawford and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Returning to this committee where I was a staffer who worked on T21 in WRDA and stood along the wall, as many of the staffers will do today, is an honor. Safety, including the safety of railroad employees, railroad passengers, and communities through which railroads operate, is FRA's top priority. FRA carries out its mission in many ways, including through our broad regulatory enforcement and oversight program of inspections and audits. FRA also conducts accident and incident investigations, scientific research, data collection and analysis, and provides extensive technical assistance. FRA also reviewed the safety integration plans of the largest rail company transactions before the Surface Transportation Board in several decades. The bipartisan infrastructure law provides an unprecedented investment in America's rail transportation system. It includes dedicated and sustained funding that enables FRA to continue its core safety mission while broadening its rail development and investment portfolio. Among them are substantial funds to deter and mitigate two longstanding rail safety issues: highway rail grade crossing collisions and trespassing. Through other grant programs, FRA will support training and education for our industry's workforce to help ensure appropriate job protections for those working on federally funded rail projects. With these expected historic investments in our nation's rail system, supporting the industry's workforce in safely and efficiently operating and maintaining the current system while preparing for the future is now more critical than ever. FRA's approach to safety is data-driven, risk-based, and collaborative. The full implementation of positive train control technology was significant. FRA continues monitoring PTC, including software updates, training, and integration into operations. With the issuance of the Risk Reduction Program and System Safety Program rules, railroads have been required to systemically identify, prioritize, and mitigate risks, and to actively promote continuous safety improvement and strengthen their safety culture by actively engaging the workforce. FRA continues to work on other significant regulatory initiatives mandated by Congress and to address known hazards more broadly. For example, in February, FRA expanded the scope of the agency's alcohol and drug control regulations, and we expect to issue soon a final rule dedicated to locomotive recording devices. Yesterday, FRA published a final rule requiring certain railroads to develop and implement fatigue risk management programs as a part of their larger risk reduction and system safety programs. Aside from these initiatives, FRA is seeking to engage all stakeholders in consensus-based safety improvements and rulemaking through the Railroad Safety Advisory Committee, which we rechartered in late 2021. It will meet again on June 27th. In April of this year, FRA held its first ever track and railroad workplace safety symposium, during which over 600 technical experts shared best practices. Similarly, in the spirit of partnership and collaboration, FRA is seeking to expand the confidential close call reporting system, C3RS, which enables railroad employees to report close calls and unsafe events and conditions without fear of reprisal or discipline. As we look forward, FRA already had several initiatives underway included in the bipartisan infrastructure law. In late 2019, FRA established an online portal to receive, store, and retrieve public reports on blocked highway rail grade crossings. And just today, we issued a request for information to solicit public input on how to make that tool even more useful. Other efforts are well underway to implement the bipartisan infrastructure law sections related to high-speed rail operations and pre-revenue service safety validation plans. With respect to infrastructure investments, FRA just announced the CRISI grants totaling nearly $369 million for 46 projects across 32 states. And we exceeded the bipartisan law's 25% rural set-aside. In conclusion, FRA is committed to continuing to lead, promote, and strengthen efforts among all stakeholders to achieve meaningful and continuous improvements in rail transportation safety. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we recognize Mr. Chapman. You may proceed, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. We appreciate this opportunity to share insights regarding issues relating to freight railroad safety. I have a strong personal interest in rail safety. In the early 1950s, my grandfather was struck and killed in a railroad grade crossing crash. He was a volunteer firefighter on a duty call with a colleague when the collision occurred. Because of my family history, I have made rail safety and grade crossing safety specifically a priority during my time on the board. Improving rail worker safety is on our most wanted list of transportation safety improvements. Improving rail worker safety means making sure that roadway workers have the training, equipment, rest, and layers of protection they need while working on or around tracks. It means making sure that crews operating trains, carrying hazardous materials, have time to escape in case of an accident. It also means reducing the risks of derailments and collisions as trains are getting longer and heavier. Although rail worker fatalities have declined overall in recent years, we continue to see recurring safety issues in our accident investigations that are 100% preventable. Of particular concern is the continued reliance on train approach warning for roadway workers. Under FRA regulations, train approach warning is a method of establishing on-track safety for workers using a lookout whose sole duty is to watch for approaching trains and equipment. It is susceptible to human error, such as underestimating the time needed for workers to clear tracks. We have long been concerned with the use of train approach warning as the sole form of worker protection, primarily because it lacks redundancy. Trains travel at deceivingly high speeds, and without proper warning, workers may not have enough time to react. Based on our investigations, we have made recommendations to the FRA to ensure that lookouts have the tools necessary to warn work crews of approaching trains. Likewise, we have recommended that the FRA define when the risks associated with using train approach warning are unacceptable and revise its regulations to prohibit it in those cases. Although dialogue is ongoing, FRA has yet to implement these recommendations. In 2018, in Bowie, Maryland, a young man, just 21 years old, lost his life in a preventable accident. He was standing in a work zone on an active track in the path of Amtrak Train 86, which was traveling at nearly 100 miles per hour. In this case, Amtrak's reliance on train approach warning resulted in failure to take advantage of the protections that could have been provided by PTC. In controlled track territory, the risk of roadway workers being struck by a train can be reduced by using working limits or speed restrictions, which would enable the PTC protections. We recommended that Amtrak and all Class I railroads eliminate the use of train approach warning in controlled track territory during planned maintenance and inspection activities. Mr. Chairman, fatigue decreases a person's alertness and ability to work safely. Currently, FRA hours of service regulations are limited to employees directly involved with the movement of a train. However, FRA regulations do not cover roadway workers, who are just as critical to ensure safe operations. FRA has indicated it does not have the legal authority to extend these regulations. NTSB disagrees, and we encourage Congress to consider clarifying the agency's authority. We have also investigated accidents involving high-hazard flammable trains, breached tank cars, and fires, placing crews at unnecessary risk by not reasonably separating them from combustibles. In 2017, we recommended that the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration evaluate the risks posed to train crews to determine the adequate separation distance between hazardous materials and occupied cars to ensure crews are protected during normal operations and accident conditions. FRA should revise its regulations to reflect those findings. In the interim, we recommend that PHMSA require that all trains have a minimum of 5 buffer cars between any crew-occupied equipment and cars carrying hazardous materials. The sequencing of cars in a train and controlling train movement continue to be areas of interest in our investigations, not only regarding the safe placement of hazardous materials, but also for reducing the risks of derailments and collisions through effectively managing in-train forces.
Please wrap up.
Mr. Chairman, rail remains one of the safest means of transportation, yet there will always be room for improvement. The safety issues we continue to see in our investigations are tragic because they are preventable. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. We'll now move on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I will start with myself. Administrator Bowes, in 1974, FRA began its automated track inspection program. Just a few years ago, the Class 1 railroads began operating automated track inspection, or ATI, test programs. 4 of those ATI test programs continue today. Are the technologies operated under those ATI test programs prohibited by the current FRA regulations?
Mr. Chairman, no.
Okay. Yesterday, you finalized a rule on fatigue risk management programs that we required in 2008. Can you please share with the committee how you plan to ensure railroads plan seriously tackle fatigue, a known but persistent safety threat?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. Fatigue is definitely an issue that FRA focuses on. As you know, safety is FRA's priority. And when it comes to fatigue, it's also about hours of service and rest. And we know that the cognitive abilities of railroad workers are very, very important. So when it comes to fatigue, we want to make sure that we're looking at the whole picture, and we think the fatigue risk management rule will help us address those. Another important component of that is the consultation with workers that we expect to happen in a robust, comprehensive way.
So you definitely see the issue around fatigue continue to plague the safety of the overall system.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And now recognize Mr. Crawford for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to direct this question to Administrator Bowes. Automated track inspection safety technology has been developed for years with the unwavering support of the FRA. ATI has been shown to help reduce freight rail accidents and identify safety risks that manual inspections may not spot. ATI is also meant to complement, not to replace, manual inspections and can free up inspectors to focus on other important safety duties. Given the clear proven benefits of ATI for freight rail safety, why has the FRA suddenly decided to deny petitions to continue testing ATI technology?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I'm limited in some of my responses because the issue is in litigation, as you know, and there's also a petition for reconsideration. But I'm going to make some factual statements because I want to answer your question to the extent that I can. First, prior to my arrival at FRA, those test programs that you talked about didn't seek public comments. It wasn't a transparent process. We've cleared that up. We're going forward. We made sure that it is a transparent process so that we can get comments in that. Second, railroads can use ATI without FRA test programs, without waivers. Like you said, ATI can catch things that visual inspections can't. Visual inspections can catch things that ATI can't, such as roadbed, vegetation, tie condition, track component defects. And those are really, really important parts of track inspections that I just wanted to highlight. We continue the Ford test programs. We're going to get data from those, Congressman, and we're going to use that data to see how to go forward. The Railroad Safety Advisory Committee is also looking at this. We want to do this in a collaborative way, and they're looking at the issue directly, and hopefully we can reach a consensus on a path forward.
As I indicated in my question, ATI is not meant to complement, not replace manual inspections. So I think the two can work together in a complementary fashion. But let me move on. During the Obama administration, FRA released a proposed rule to require Class 1 freight rail to operate with 2 people in the cab of a locomotive. FRA noted it could not provide, quote, could not provide reliable or conclusive statistical data to suggest whether one-person crew operations are generally safer or less safe than multiple-person crew operations, end quote. The Trump administration then withdrew that rulemaking, recognizing a lack of safety data to justify its implementation. Given plans to now revive the 2-man crew rule, is there any new data to support a safety justification for this rule?
Congressman, as we've put out publicly, the draft proposed rule is in review right now, and it's going to address the things that you brought up. We know that in the past, data has been a concern. We've heard about it. In my year and a half at the FRA, we want to make sure that the proposed rule that we have gets robust set of comments so that we know what stakeholders are saying about the rule and the public saying about the rule. We definitely want to address the risks associated with less than a 2-person crew.
Well, let me just say that I have some concerns about this. Is possibly that the administration may just be fulfilling another campaign promise to labor unions. I mean, we're suffering from the worst inflation we've seen in 40+ years, and now we're talking about increasing labor costs, which are, you know, the brunt of which are borne downstream by the consumer. So I want to make sure that whatever rulemaking we're engaging in is actually based on real safety concerns and not just fulfilling promises to unions on the part of the administration. The reality is that it was withdrawn under the previous administration for that very reason, because there was no empirical evidence that suggested that there was greater safety with multiple-person crews. And so I just want to make sure that going forward that is the primary consideration, is safety, and not promises to particular stakeholders that were made during a campaign. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and with all due respect to my colleague, Class 1s primarily run two-man crews now, so there would be no major increase in labor costs. Next, we'll hear from the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you, Administrator Bose. Congratulations on your confirmation, and thank you in particular for all your work on the Gateway project, both before you took this job and today. You and I toured the existing Hudson Tunnel with Secretary Buttigieg last summer, and I know you've been a champion of this project, which thankfully now is funded under the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and I look forward to working with you to get it over the finish line ahead of schedule, under budget. That is the challenge before us today. I want to get right back to the topic that the ranking member raised. June of 2019, your predecessor was sitting in that chair, and I asked him what I thought were some pretty straightforward questions about the length of trains and crew sizes. I asked him, should we have 3-mile-long freight trains? Should we have 5-mile-long freight trains? Should we have 10-mile-long freight trains? I asked him, let's say you have a 3-mile-long train operated by one crew member, and the train breaks down. How long would it take for that single crew member to walk from the front of the train all the way to the back of the train to try to figure out what was going on as first responders tried to get around the train? And in some cases, entire communities are simply divided in half. And Administrator Batory said, well, might take 2 hours, 3 hours. Then he added, depends on if he's a good walker or not. I don't know if that qualifies as data, but actually it kind of does make sense. I mean, isn't it just common sense that there are safety concerns related to a very long train with one human being on the train? Trains break down. No matter how good the technology is, at the end of the day, you're going to need a person or people to be able to figure out what went wrong and to fix it, and ideally to prevent the thing from going wrong in the first place. Would you agree?
Congressman, absolutely. And I'll tell you something, when I came to FRA that was sort of amazing to me was that FRA was not measuring train length in accidents and investigations. We've changed that because it's always about the data we hear. So we're now taking stock of the size of trains. And like you also said, training is an important part of that. Communication between the different parts of the train is an important component of that. So train length brings a whole host of issues that are now things that we have to address in a holistic way.
Okay, thank you so much. Switching gears, or maybe switching tracks, I want to quickly reaffirm my support for a few grant applications from New Jersey Transit that are currently under review at FRA. First, a mega program grant to enhance 69 commuter rail and bus stations across New Jersey and New York. Second, a state of good repair grant for the Tunnel Avenue right-of-way bridge, which is part of the Hudson Tunnel project. Third, a state of good repair grant for improvements to Newark Penn Station, as well as for planning and pre-construction activities for the Hunter flyover. I hope for full and fair consideration at FRA. Look forward to hearing back from you soon on those. And I want to particularly ask you about the Hunter flyover. I'm sure you're familiar with that project from your previous work. It's critical to one of the main commuter railways in my district, the Raritan Valley line. I wonder if you might offer some thoughts about the importance of that project.
Congressman, anytime we can make improvements on rail, and particularly known spots like that one, we absolutely want to. And we know that the grant programs that the bipartisan law enabled and the projects, the opportunities that it presents are going to lead to increased safety outcomes and also better capacity and also more opportunities to increase ridership. So projects of that nature are the things that, again, the bipartisan infrastructure law, just a year ago, it wasn't even possible, and now there's an endless amount of possibilities.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now hear from this gentleman from Illinois, my friend, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Love that suit today, too. I got to get me one of those. Hey, first off, my first question is going to be for Administrator Bose. In December of 2019, your predecessor, Administrator Batory, launched the Blocked Rail Crossing Incident Reporter for public and law enforcement to report blocked highway rail grade crossings. And the goal of the program was to address blocked crossings through identifying chronic problems and working to address the underlying issues. Excuse me. While blocked crossings occur in every corner of America, in my district, we're having issues in the communities of Bement and Decatur that I urge you to work with all parties to address. My staff has consistently referred constituents to the FRA's incident reporter, and so far 235 reports have been filed in Bement and 197 reports have been filed in Decatur since the tool's launch. In these municipalities, Trains block crossings for hours and sometimes days at a time. The communities are literally divided. Emergency response times are slowed. Access to schools cut off. And frustrated citizens consistently have their lives disrupted. What is the FRA doing with the data collected, and what steps are being taken to further address block crossings?
Congressman, thank you for that question, and I wish your communities didn't experience those block crossings. At FRA, what we do with that data is we look at it very closely to the extent that we can reach out to the railroad companies directly and share that data with them, let them know that we're hearing a lot of complaints from that specific area, and talk to them about operational changes that they can make, improvements that they can make. Also now, again, with the grant programs that we have, if we need to grade separate, we talk about those opportunities as well. But the contact with the community and our constant back and forth with the community and the railroads is very, very important. So we want to facilitate those conversations, and we want to make sure that we can reach a conclusion, a positive outcome collaboratively.
Are these numbers high compared to other communities?
They are high.
Okay. On another issue in my district, we've consistently had the worst on-time service for the Saluki Express and the Illini Express Amtrak routes in central and eastern and southern Illinois. Can you give me any update on what's being done to address those issues on those lines? Has the FRA heard anything from the rail lines or from Amtrak?
Yes, Congressman, I'm glad you asked about that. We now have quarterly metrics and standards reports that we get reports on-time performance. And we're now at a point where we've had consistent quarterly reports where we can look at next steps. And I know Amtrak is looking at next steps to address those issues in a comprehensive manner. As you stated, these lines are well known to have had years and years of continuous delays, and now we think we have the tools in our toolbox necessary to move forward in a positive direction to address those. And again, our funding programs, if there are issues with specific places that need sidings, that need improved grade crossings, we have the ability to fund those projects. So let's address them together and move forward so that there are no delays.
I appreciate that. Are the tools you're talking about tools to address the short shunt issue in those particular lines?
Yeah, the short shunt issues are things that we're looking at actively right now with Amtrak, with Canadian National in particular. And we've been looking very, very closely at them, and we think that there's been some very positive movement.
Well, I appreciate your optimism, but forgive me for being somewhat of a pessimist because I've had this same conversation for years now. And I get a lot of positive talk that we're all working together, but I don't see the improvement to fix the short shunt issue on those particular lines. And I said the last time your predecessor was here and the Amtrak CEO was here, and anyone related to this particular problem, we got to see results. And frankly, until we see results, we're going to continue to push and put more pressure to help our constituents. And I appreciate your time today. Thank you for your responses. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
We will now hear from the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Gentlemen, a big topic of conversation these days in freight railroad world is precision scheduled railroading. And it seems to me that PSR affects a variety of constituents. It affects customers, our shippers, the employers of businesses that rely on rail transportation. It affects citizens who benefit from shipping more goods by rail, like literally everyone who ever gets on a highway or a road and encounters a truck. It affects railroad employees and most specifically their safety. Speaking of safety, the American public, of course, is affected by railroad safety. It affects railroad infrastructure writ large, how much money railroads are pouring into improving their infrastructure or whether it stays the same. PSR affects Wall Street shareholders, And I'd even add that it affects Hunter Harrison's legacy. But it seems to me that on that long list, customers, American citizens, railroad employees, railroad infrastructure, Hunter Harrison, and Wall Street, the only beneficiary from PSR has been Wall Street. I don't even think Hunter Harrison's legacy will come out looking good in the long run here. So I'd like to ask a few questions about this. We've seen in recent days hiring plans at railroads right now focused on running more trains, trying to address the capacity problem, but maintenance positions are stagnant, are completely stagnant. Since railways drastically started reducing headcount in 2016 due to PSR and an obsession with raw operating ratios, collision rates have been stagnant despite purported technological advances in safety. And we don't see more maintenance of way employees coming back to work. Administrator Bose, Mr. Chapman, either of you can answer this. Is there a connection here? And what are we going to do to get the railroads better maintained?
Let me say first, from a safety standpoint, we're certainly aware of the concerns that PSR concerns. We've not investigated any accidents that were specifically related to PSR, but the issues that folks have expressed concern about, fatigue, external issues, training, oversight, makeup of trains, those are issues that we would look at in any accident investigation. So it's on our radar to the extent that the concerns that people are expressing might be a factor in a particular accident, but we've had no accident investigations that were specifically related to PSR.
Mr. Chapman, have derailments been on the rise?
I'm sorry?
Have derailments been on the rise?
Let me check on that number. We'll get you a number here in just a minute. I don't believe
What
it's
about-
on the rise.
What about train breaks, trains breaking apart? Have they been on the rise?
I'm not aware that we've seen a pattern in that regard.
Well, I think we better check into that because I've heard from several of railroad officials that that is exactly the case. And it's striking to me that you would not know. Administrator Bose?
Congressman, as you know, safety is FRA's priority, and PSR is a term that encompasses many different aspects of safety and operations. I can assure you that FRA is looking at the operational and process changes that seem to have resulted from the railroad's implementation of what's called PSR. We know that the operation of fewer, longer trains without the technology and training to support such operations could affect safety, along with the removal of mechanical forces that allows train crews to perform mechanical inspections. And we know that technology replacing the workforce with technology that's not as effective may not lead to good outcomes. And we're even looking at things like ineffective job briefings. So we have to look at all of this in a holistic way, including hours of service, fatigue, and training. So I want to assure you that we are on the job here looking at things to make sure that safety is paramount.
Well, Administrator Bose, it's not just safety, it's about service. It's about the safety of our highways because a lot of customers are shifting traffic to trucks because they can't get the service that they need from common carrier railways. And Mr. Chapman, I think that Mr. Bose's statement there was a sort of long technical way of saying that we better look into train breaks and derailments because I think we'll find that they're absolutely on the rise and they're related to longer trains. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now hear from the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Bose, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Bose, you have emphasized the importance of the role of the innovation would play in reaching FRA's safety goals. Now, I'm sure that you know, as technology evolves and our nation innovates, it is important to use the most up-to-date information and data to make decisions. Will you make a commitment today to using the most up-to-date data when making decisions about the use of new technology, and will you commit to sharing with this committee the data to make those decisions once the FRA has decided it?
Yes, sir.
In April, the Biden administration announced trucking action plan in an attempt to help the industry. During the same month, the Secretary called for railroads to improve their current self-service levels, which are similar, being impacted by the nation's challenge to recruit and retrain qualified employees. However, FRA has not acted with the same urgency to help railroads address these workforce challenges. Why have you not taken steps for the rail to address those concerns, and what, if any, specific steps has the Biden administration or DOT taken to address workforce shortages in the rail industry?
Congressman, first, I just want to lead off with the railroads and their workforce have been instrumental in helping us get through the pandemic and the jobs that they've done throughout this time. We know that there's been backups on the supply chain. I point you to the April 27th Surface Transportation Board hearing, where there was an earful said about the supply chain issues that the railroads are facing. The Surface Transportation Board is looking at it very closely. Just yesterday, they issued an order because the railroads didn't provide sufficient data and didn't answer the questions that the Surface Transportation Board's asked in terms of reporting. So we need to continue to get accurate information to see what's going on in the first place. When you mentioned worker shortages, that's a perennial issue that's developed in recent years because of cutbacks that the railroad companies have made themselves. Now, I'm not in the business of them operating and hiring workers or removing workers, but the railroads themselves have said that there's a worker shortage. We want to make sure that the workers that they retain and bring on board have a safe workplace, have a good workplace so that they can retain those workers, and those workers can continue and make railroading their career, their life's ambition, and also a safe workplace. We want to make sure of that. In terms of the supply chain, just quickly, Congressman, I know my time's short. The President established the Supply Chain Disruption Task Force. The Secretary is a part of that. The Port Envoy, General Lyons, was just appointed a couple of weeks ago. He works closely with the FRA to address any challenges that we see on the supply chain having to do with rail. And we also work cooperatively with the railroad companies themselves to facilitate anything that they need from us to help them move the supply chain and leave those disruptions behind.
Yeah, the only thing I disagree with you on is the fact that you'd say the railroads, that they cut their workforce. I have been talking with them. They're having trouble recruiting and getting drivers or getting engineers and workers back after COVID like other industry. Now, the concern I'd have is the same thing that I have in the trucking industry, which is the industry I came from. When we're trying desperately to recruit new employees, safety is vitally important. And with safety, we implemented it both in trucking and rail and other heavy equipment that certain safety tests are given that would check your blood alcohol level and or any drug level. And I believe that we are having several states right now that have legalized marijuana. And with alcohol, it only takes about 8 hours to process out to a safe level. With marijuana, we end up with the tests that we have, all of a sudden we have these new employees popping positive and or not being able to pass a drug test at all. And with that, we're losing valuable employees that we should have. And I think it's a concern that we should look into on the national level, though we don't want to violate the 10th Amendment. Still, many of these states are putting us in situations where we're having trouble recruiting for these type of jobs. I appreciate your input on this, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We'll now have Mr. Garcia from Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing on freight rail safety, and thank you to our witnesses on both panels for appearing today. My first question is for Mr. Bose of the FRA. In your testimony, you note some of the recent actions that the FRA has taken to address fatigue among railroad employees and advance train crew staffing safety requirements. I applaud these actions and your leadership, but more action, of course, is needed to address the harm to workers from precision scheduled railroading, including the increased safety risk workers are facing as a result of PCR. Many of the labor representatives testifying on the second panel have highlighted other issues that need to be addressed. These issues include the lack of time for carmen to inspect cars, railroad scheduling, and attendance practices like high vis that lead to more fatigue among workers, and a lack of protections for railroad workers performing track work. What is the FRA doing to address these issues, and how is the FRA in general working with labor unions and railroads to address railroad employees' concerns about the effects of PSR?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. This is definitely an issue we hear a lot about, especially due to the attendance policies that some of the railroads have instituted over recent times. When it comes to fatigue, FRA has instituted a couple of things I want to share. When it comes to any accident investigation that involves human factors as a possible cause of the accident, we collect information about fatigue. We also put out a survey at the beginning of this year where we got upwards of 10,000 comments from specifically conductors and engineers about their experiences with fatigue and hours of service. So we're analyzing that data right now. In addition, I've also reminded the railroads when it comes to their attendance policies that rest away from home is not the same as rest at home. And you can't in perpetuity be away from home and be properly rested. In addition to that, Congressman, one more aspect of what FRA does, we're also continuously looking into research and conducting research about fatigue and its impact on workers. So we're addressing in many ways, but I get your broader point that it is a very important topic that we need to address on a continuing basis here and now.
Thank you for that. I want to squeeze two more questions in, so your brevity would be much appreciated. Block railroad crossings are a big issue in my district as well. You mentioned in your testimony that you're planning to do outreach to local communities to get their input as you update FRA's Block Rail Crossing portal. Can you expand on this outreach, what it looks like, and how my local communities can give you input if they would like to? And are you planning to do any visits to locations with a lot of block crossings like Chicago to meet with local communities and residents?
Congressman, a couple of things there. We just put out a request for information on ways to make our portal even better for block crossing. So I'd urge your communities to provide input through that process. The second thing is the grade crossing elimination program in the bipartisan infrastructure law that you supported. We're going to go out with a notice of funding opportunity, and also in that do webinars for communities so that they can apply for funding. So those are two ways of doing it. FRA has had offices based in communities throughout the country. In Illinois is an example. So we have field personnel spread throughout the country, and they're always available to talk to your communities. And I'll follow up with your office directly to make sure that they contact and speak to your communities, get that input directly.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to squeeze my last question in. Mr. Cauthen's testimony makes a compelling case that the FRA must take a more active role in overseeing the railroad's management of physical forces on a train as it moves. Railroads are blaming human error as other miscellaneous causes when they report train derailments to the FRA, but oftentimes it is incorrect decision of a railroad to make up equipment of a train that leads to its derailment. The improper coding gives an incorrect picture of the causes of train derailments. So what action is FRA taking to hold railroads accountable, and what's the FRA doing to better identify the causes and ensure that codes appropriately reflect the circumstances or derailments?
Quickly.
Congressman, we're going to improve our coding. Just so you know, we are aware of Mr. Cauthen's paper. He definitely shared it with FRA, and I think it's an important contribution to the dialogue. As you know, the National Academy of Sciences is doing a study on long trains. FRA has also a study that's been ongoing that focuses on the brake aspects of long trains. So we're going to continue to make sure that research goes forward in a comprehensive way, and that we seek comment from the workers that operate these trains so that we know that the research addresses their real-life experiences.
Thank you.
Next, we will hear from gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know the conversation will continue on the issue with railroad track time and the labor issues with that. When I've talked with folks on either end of the industry, whether on the train side or the receiving end of those products, it's a giant problem. So I appreciate you being here today and addressing that. One of the issues that we're looking at is that, well, first let me back up a little bit. Not long ago, Biden administration announced a trucking action plan to help the industry increase the number of truck drivers we have on the road, which is even more critical with some of the train issues we have. So it's especially for the long haul routes, but we have not seen that I know of an action yet taken by the administration to replace or improve the employment barriers for the railroad side of it. So as we're talking about maybe an improvement in the trucking area, we need to have that dramatically increased and improved in railroad employment. So the Secretary of Transportation has called for railroads to improve their service levels. Railroads have stated on multiple occasions they are having difficulty recruiting and retaining, et cetera. So with the issues we're having with supply chain, and whether it's imports or domestic production, we have a lot of ability in this country to make up for imports, and we shouldn't be so dependent on imports anyway, in my view. For food production and fertilizer, as we know, because obviously for food production you need fertilizer to get the yields that we're accustomed to. So we can make up for it with the capacity we have in this country. As you know, urea is going to be a bigger problem since the major exporters of it are Russia and China and Qatar, and they're cutting it off. And so what's important about urea, not only as a nitrogen source for fertilizer and growing food, but what is known as diesel exhaust fluid to keep the newer engines from post-2010 running cleaner. It's an additive that basically is fed into the exhaust system downstream of the engine that if you don't have it on trucks, tractors, other equipment that are programmed for it, it won't run. Not only would it just not run well, the computer system basically shuts it down. You can't operate the vehicle, the tractor, whatever, without the diesel exhaust fluid, the blue fluid, as you know. So there's becoming a big supply chain problem on that. And what can the administration do to be helping with the production of that as well as the transportation? Because my understanding is the railroad folks are, without the labor to move the product, are starting to cut back. Some of the truck stop people that would be vending it, they just don't have the capacity to move it. This is going to be a giant crisis here, yet another one, really soon, if trucks and other equipment that is needed does not have this DEF, the DEF product, to keep those newer, cleaner running engines operating. Now we can do other things. We can pull old trucks out of inventory that don't require that, or maybe go back to older tractors, or try to get a waiver on bypassing the system. That's not going to be popular with the EPA or anybody. So what should we do about this? DEF is going to be a big problem, and if the rails can't move it, what are we going to do about that?
Congressman, that's something that I'm happy to look into more and address it. In terms of working with the industry, we're happy to do that and continue doing that to find ways to move the goods and the commodities that we need. I just want to mention and address what you talked about, workforce and increasing the railroad workforce. In the CRISI grants that I mentioned in my opening statement, there was a grant that we gave for workforce development efforts. It was for Amtrak mechanical employees, specifically. But again, the funding that we have available now is going to unlock some possibilities and workforce improvement, increasing workforce opportunities.
Well,
We're going to look for
Amtrak
those.
doesn't move the ball on what I'm talking about here, and I need you to grasp the urgency of what I'm talking about here. Because if we don't have this fluid, this DEF, getting where it needs to be, the trucks don't run, right? And if you got it, a truck brought it is one of the common phrases, is that goods, food, whatever, is not gonna get moved from production to the shelf, or even pre-production, you know, from the field to the mill, whatever it is.
5 seconds.
This is a critical situation, so we need not be just looking into it. We need urgency from the administration to look at an immediate way to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Next, hear from the gentlelady from California, Ms. Napolitano, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Administrator, it's good to see you again. I know you're familiar with my community. It's the San Gabriel Valley of California, which has 160 trains daily in residential communities next to businesses and along school property. There are many grade crossings that cause major safety, congestion, and pollution concerns in my district. How is the infrastructure law improving grade crossing safety and installing grade separations? And secondly, I have significant concerns over the train length and the impact it has on safety in local communities. I've waited over 20 minutes for a train over 100 or 200 rail cars passing my community. What is the FRA doing to address the increased length of trains?
Congressman, thanks for those questions. First off, when you're talking about grade crossings and improving or eliminating those, I have had the opportunity to visit both the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. We also pulled together a series of communities and local governments in that area to talk to them about the opportunities in the bipartisan infrastructure law and really pointing them to programs like CREATE, where they can come together. And I know you're familiar with the Alameda Corridor and all the improvements there on grade
It
crossings.
runs right through my district.
Yes, ma'am. And so that's the kind of effort that we want to make sure that communities are aware of. When you talk about long trains, it's definitely something that the FRA is looking into. As I mentioned earlier, that just collecting the data on that is something that FRA has started to do to make sure that we know what's going on in the system overall. We talked about in-train forces and the effects that long trains have on that. We also need to make sure the workers operating those trains are trained in the proper way possible, and also there can be communication breakdowns that happen on long trains. So the points that you made are very good ones, and we're happy to follow up with your office more directly.
Well, I'd like to follow up with you and make sure that maybe if you have a chance to visit my district, you can see what impacts it has on the people and on the business in the area. But I certainly am very pleased that you are there to take care of some of the issues that we talk about. And maybe we can, one more question that just brought to mind is the Operations Lifesaver. I know it's a volunteer group out of the railroads, but how can we help make it a committee or a group that really focuses on safety, that is not volunteer, that is set up by you and the railroads? Because it is essential when you have great crossings that are near schools and there's kids involved.
Congressman, Operation Lifesaver is very much a part of FRA's efforts. Just last week, they attended a conference about level boarding and grade crossing issues. So they're a very big partner to FRA. We fund them based on the money that Congress provides on a recurring basis year after year, and we definitely look for any opportunities to continue to partner with them. They just had their 50th anniversary, and we were happy to celebrate it to them, but we're looking for ways to enhance them. enhance their views on that. And I'll pass it over to Mr. Chapman.
Yeah, Congresswoman, I'll add that we at NTSB have a very good relationship with Operation Lifesaver. I work with them myself personally because of my own personal interest in grade crossing safety. They do outstanding work, and obviously want to see additional support for them in any way possible.
Well, I'd like to be sure that we have our schools available to tap into those sources, because it is quite a problem with the Elementary Corridor East that doesn't have all the grade crossings that are necessary to prevent any accidents or anything happening in the area. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Young lady yields back. We'll now hear from Mr. Balderson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here today. My first question is for Administrator Bose. About a month ago, FRA announced the establishment of the Corridor Identification and Development Program. According to the FRA, the program will facilitate the development of intercity passenger rail corridors. However, the FRA will not require that any proposals demonstrate the commitment of host freight railroads. Does FRA believe freight railroad consolidation and participation is necessary in this program?
Congressman, on shared corridors, especially those owned by host railroads, projects will not go forward without the host railroads' cooperation and participation.
Thank you. Can you expand a little bit more on the role of the freight railroads in this program, please?
In the corridor identification program, well, I'll start from the beginning. Right after the bipartisan infrastructure law passed, we did several webinars. We reached out to the Class 1 railroads directly to ask them for comments as a part of the program so that the program would be informed by their views and would be stronger based on their views. So we sought their input in the first place. Then when we developed the program, we knew that going forward, again, that host railroads were absolutely necessary in participating. And we emphasize that in the technical assistance that we provide to any community, any state, any locality that's looking at doing the corridor program.
Perfect. Thank you very much. My next question, Administrator, is the FRA's guidance for the Corridor Identification and Development Program. The FRA is requiring applicants state whether they intend to select Amtrak as its operator or not. Can you explain why FRA is requiring this determination so early in the process?
Congressman, can you repeat that? I didn't catch that.
Yes, sir, I sure can. I apologize. In the FRA's guidance for the Corridor Identification and Development Program, the FRA is requiring applicants state whether they intend to select Amtrak as its operator or not. Can you explain why the FRA is requiring this determination so early in the process?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. We're just seeking that for informational purposes. It in a way, helps determine how far along the corridor development is, whether it's Amtrak or a private operator or a non-Amtrak operator. It's just a question asking if that box has been checked off.
Okay, I'm gonna follow up. To be clear, would the FRA encourage and protect competitive bidding for other rail operators in this program?
Congressman, absolutely. And let me be clear on that. We have a private operator in Florida. We have a private operator developing a railroad in California, Nevada, in Texas, and we encourage other private operators throughout the country to look at passenger rail opportunities in the United States.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your answers. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now hear from Mr. Johnson from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And I want to thank the witnesses for your time and your testimony. And I apologize for the bad lighting. I'm in a bad situation trying to do the best I can. But the U.S. has the largest rail network in the world, and keeping such an extensive system running safely is a heavy lift. Many issues continue to plague railroads today, and they are due in part to cost cuts and bare bones operational plans implemented across freight railroads. And these cost cutting measures are celebrated and encouraged by Wall Street. Meanwhile, Americans face job losses, poor rail service, and potentially deadly situations for railroad employees. Safety and quality of service should always be the priority, not profit. In 2021, Class 1 railroads had more than 1,200 train accidents and 9 employees died. In 1 month alone, 2 conductors with less than a year of service were struck by moving equipment and suffered serious injuries. Despite that, conductor certification training has been shortened by the railroads when onboarding new conductors. Mr. Bose, does the FRA have concerns about the quality of certification trainings, given that the reduced certification period risks worker safety?
Congressman, that's something that FRA looks at every day, and we know the concerns that have been expressed, and we've actually caught some situations where the training and certification process needs to be improved, and we've shared that with the railroads directly so that the system can be safe.
Are there any other plans that FRA has to address that concern?
Yes, sir. The bipartisan infrastructure law actually asks FRA to look at the certification program, and we have that underway. And again, we're looking at those training programs railroad by railroad. And anytime we identify gaps or deficiencies or areas where improvements are needed, we make sure that the railroad makes those right away. We want to make sure that when railroad workers operate on the trains or provide service, that they're well-trained and well-versed. These are special skills that are required to be railroaders.
Thank you. Mr. Chapman, in your testimony, you detail a number of accidents, including some with fatalities, that occurred despite use of the train approach warning or TAW method used by crew members. Mr. Chapman, can you briefly describe the TAW method for us and some circumstances where it would and would not be appropriate?
Congressman, it's actually a very simple system. It relies upon a watchman or a lookout to spot oncoming trains and then to warn the crew, the working crew of the oncoming train. And the requirement is to allow the crew to clear within 15 seconds before the oncoming train. The problem is that it's highly susceptible to human error, failure to, frankly, distraction, failure to properly anticipate the oncoming train. Trains move very quickly. So we have seen some accidents that were quite tragic. The one that I highlighted in my statement was the Amtrak accident in Bowie, Maryland, where a young man was killed, struck by an oncoming Amtrak train moving at 100 miles an hour. He was standing on an active track, had no other place really where solid footing was available to him. What we believe is that in controlled track areas that we're not seeing the railroads take sufficient advantage of the capabilities of the PTC system, which allows speed limitations and other work limits to be put in place to ensure that we don't have to rely on such a relatively rudimentary system as train approach warning.
Thank you. My time is expired and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now hear from Mr. Johnson. from South Dakota.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to have a conversation with Mr. Bose, particularly related to crew size. I know a few years ago, FRA had noted that it lacked empirical evidence to suggest that one-person crews were either more safe or less safe than two-person crews. Sir, does the FRA have any new data or different findings?
Congressman, we'll be happy to share that with you when the notice of proposed rulemaking comes out in the near future. In terms of data, we know, and the last NPRM, the notice of proposed rulemaking in 2016, cited Castleton, South Dakota as a place where an incident happened where the crew worked together, and having a less than two-person crew in that situation could have been a very negative, even more negative outcome there. You mentioned data. FRA also subsequently to that withdrawal notice has had research, and we've conducted even more research about crew size. So we're happy to have that a part of the record when the notice of proposed rulemaking goes out.
Yeah, and I do think, I mean, the South Dakota example is illuminating. Of course, it is just one example. It's an anecdote. We can learn from those things, but I do think we want to make decisions. We want to promulgate rules based on good data. Are you not in a position to be able to release that data to the public prior to a rulemaking?
Congressman, it has to be a part of the rulemaking because right now we're in deliberative process putting that together. But we're happy to walk through the NPRM when that comes out with you, with your staff, with the committee. I know there'll be a lot of interest.
Well, and to be clear, sir, I'm not asking that you would share with me your what you intend to introduce as a proposed rule. I understand that that would be protected by the deliberative process, but certainly safety data is something that you could release in advance of an NPRM, isn't it?
It depends on what type of safety data you're talking about, Congressman. We definitely have readily available data on an ongoing basis that we put up on our website. But we're happy to, I will follow up with your office and go over some specific data that we can share.
Yeah, I think that would be instructive. Of course, whatever we do, we want to be evidence-based and data-driven. Do you have a timeline in mind for next steps with regard to the NPRM?
The NPRM's under review right now, and it's hard to pinpoint an exact time on that.
So we don't know whether that would be weeks or months or longer?
It's going to depend, Congressman, on the review process. I wish I could be more specific. I'm sorry I can't be.
Congressman, if I could add something from the NTSB perspective, we think the very basic step that's being taken now in modifying the incident accident report form, FRA's incident accident report form, will help ensure just better gathering of data with respect to crew size and train length. We think that very basic step will help generate considerably more useful data than what we currently have.
Sure. Well, and I would just, note, Mr. Bose, and I understand timelines can be flexible, and I'm not trying to pin you down, but, I was a regulator in a former life. I certainly, as an agency head, had a role in promulgating rules, and I always felt like one of the ways that I could help to increase trust and transparency and confidence is giving people some sense of when things might happen. And just even internally, of course, with my team, when I was a former regulator, I would say, hey, gang, we want our review to be done on X date. We'll build in a couple extra weeks of wiggle time because we know other things come up. But the idea that you just don't have any idea, when the world would get a sense of what you're planning to propose, I don't know that that's confidence inspiring. And I know you work in an incredibly difficult political and technical environment, but I would just note that I think giving rough timelines can help to buy up and build confidence in the work of the FRA. And I hope you keep that in mind as we move in the future. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We will now hear from Mr. Auchincloss for 5 minutes. Okay, next we'll move to Mr. Carter from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. My question is for Administrator Bose. Thank you for being here. I represent the 2nd Congressional District in Louisiana, which is home to a lot of quaint towns. One particularly quaint town is the city of Gretna that has a train that runs through that community. There's been talk of expanding that train. And I will tell you that the devastation of trains that go through small communities is real. It impacts commerce, it impacts quality of life, and generally has been proven to be a real problem. Can you share with me your views on how we can work to preserve the security and sanctity of our small towns to prevent these expansions of railways that run through small cities?
Congressman, for FRA, safety is absolutely our priority. So we want to make sure any trains that operate in those communities are doing so in a safe manner. In terms of the expansion, I don't have the details that you do exactly where and to what level. I can tell you that when it comes to the railroads increasing their business and increasing their footprint in a community, there are opportunities through funding, through mitigation activities that we always encourage, not to mention community input and community collaboration as a part of the process. For the Federal Railroad Administration, we want to make sure our field inspectors are there for the community to answer any questions that your constituents may have.
And we've been in communication, and I thank you for that. And I know that working with the governor's office and Secretary Wilson with the Department of Transportation Development in Louisiana, there's been discussion ongoing. I just want to flag that for you and ask that maybe we can have a further discussion offline on the specifics of the issue in the city of Gretna in Louisiana, but more generally across the board. This is an issue that plagues many communities. And while we understand the importance of commerce, we want to make sure it's done in a way that, as you mentioned, is safe, secure, and does not disassemble, if you will, the economy and community that's so important to all of us. Pivoting from that, the workforce shortages, how has that increased your ability to maintain the security of rails that run through communities?
Congressman, in terms of the staff reductions and the workforce that you just mentioned, we and FRA absolutely believe that the rail system in general is safe in its operations. There's always room for improvement. We can always do better. And we want to make sure that when the workforce increases, that the training, the certification processes are done the right way, and that we want to make sure that the infrastructure and the equipment and every other part of the railroad is as safe as possible for workers.
And has that been the case? Have you seen increase, decrease, standstill as a result?
Congressman, I'll just tell you, when I came on last year, I had seen the first half of the year especially, there were fatalities of workers, and I follow those closely. Every day, there are reports that I get about injuries and the quality of the workplace. We want to make sure that there's a safe environment for workers. So after that, I sent a letter. I contacted the railroads directly, making sure that training and awareness of the workers was paramount in their minds. So we continue to do that on a daily basis. Congressman, whether it's through inspections, through audits, through other means, FRA does that as a part of our daily work every day.
And while I applaud you for the safety of workers, that's critically important, and I stand wholeheartedly in support of that. Tell me about the security of neighborhoods and people and pedestrians.
Yeah, absolutely, Congressman. Another aspect of what this administration is focused on is equity, right? And we want to make sure that when it comes to grade crossing safety, trespasser safety, the impact that a railroad has on a community is a safe one. We've recently done a grade crossing summit to highlight safety improvements that we can make. So we'll continue to do that. Anytime you need us to engage with your communities directly, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you.
I definitely take you up on that. My time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll next have Ms. Steele from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Ranking Chair. And Administrator Bowes, earlier this year, organized crime group wreaked havoc on cargo trains in Los Angeles County, stealing packages, equipment, and other important products from railroad cars. This incident shed light on data collected from Union Pacific since December 2020, detailing the 160% increase in thefts along railroad tracks in Los Angeles County. Many of products stolen included medical equipment, electronics, and food products, some of which may currently be out of stock due to supply chain shortages. It is also important to note that many of these purchases are delivered not just in California, but throughout the United States, affecting interstate and international commerce. The safety of our freight rail system includes the safety of our rail workforce and the security of rail freight. How are you working with the Department of Justice to hold the perpetrators accountable? And how are you ensuring that this incident does not spur up again this holiday season?
Congresswoman, thank you for that question. I think you're referring specifically to what happened on Union Pacific in the LA area over the course of the last year. We've talked about workforce shortages. That's not only in terms of the operations of the trains, but it's also in their law enforcement. You know, those rights of way are privately owned. These are privately owned rail cars. They have their own police force that is to look out for vandals, for other security issues. We made it clear to Union Pacific, as well as other railroads, that security and securement of their equipment is very, very important. In the LA area, we worked with local law enforcement, as well as the governor's office and Department of Homeland Security, FBI, to make sure that those instances are not repeated, and we can improve on those. If they reoccur, we're ready to tackle those with our other agencies and law enforcement. They are very much a part of that. I'm hopeful that Union Pacific's given the attention the issue deserves so that those incidents that happened over the course of the last year aren't repeated.
So since that federal and state and local law enforcement are working together, these crimes went down, or it still stayed same, or it's it's been increased?
Congressman, I have not seen an increase in those activities. If you have information to the contrary, please feel free to share it. Another aspect of this that was really, really important is just securing the actual intermodal units that the trains were carrying and make sure they're properly locked. So I'm glad those precautions have been taken going forward.
Thank you very much, Administrator Bowes. Mr. Chairman, I have another question, but I don't think I have enough time to get answers. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna submit the writing regarding that federal funding and grants has been provided to California high-speed rail that has been already failed. So I'm gonna put this in writing and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That'll be fine. Thank you, Congresswoman.
We thank the gentlelady for her consideration, and we will next have Ms. Titus from Nevada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to ask Mr. Bowes about the rule that was released yesterday by the FRA on fatigue risk management programs. In the final rule, there was a reference to the FRA revising its accident and incident investigation procedures to analyze information on the involved railroads' attendance policies. I wonder if you could expand more on this and the reasons y'all changed your procedure. And if in the future, FRA shows that there are attendance policies that contribute to rail incidents or accidents, would the FRA consider readdressing the issue?
Congresswoman, thanks for that question. The fatigue rule, as you mentioned, in addition to that, we're also, when it comes to accident investigations, asking questions about hours of service, about fatigue. We also did a survey where we got over 10,000 responses from conductors and engineers, and we're analyzing that as well. In terms of rest, that's a very, very important issue, and attendance policies are a part of that. It's something that FRA has been reviewing and did review across the board at the railroad companies. We were not able to find a regulatory tool that we have available to address those directly, but again, we are very focused to make sure that workers are meeting the hours of service requirements that are in law. We're making sure that FRA is analyzing data, information related to hours of service and fatigue. I contacted the railroad companies to make sure that they knew that the quality of rest and quality in the attendance policies is very important, that resting away from home is not the same as resting at home, and I made that clear to them. In terms of the fatigue rule, Congresswoman, the consultation with workers is so important and such an important aspect of that. We had the risk reduction program and the system safety program come out in the last administration. There was a hole in both those regulations that dealt with consultation with workers. We knew that that could be improved on. And through the fatigue rule, we started addressing that. We need to do even more to ensure that that consultation is done, because that will lead to a better fatigue plan and better safety outcome.
You said you don't have the regulatory tools to do something. Is there measures that we could take here in this committee to give you those regulatory tools? Would you go back over that and see if there's anything we need to do or we need to bring forward?
Congresswoman, what I was referring to specifically was the attendance policies and and hours, and those are things that are often worked out through agreements between workers and the railroad companies. That's what I was referring to. What FRA does is we look at hours of service, we look at fatigue, and we make sure that we have the information that we need, and if there's anything we need to address, we do that directly.
Well, it seems that in recent years, railroads have been acting more like Wall Street, cutting workers, longer trains, less concern about the people who actually roll the trains. I just want to be sure that they're protected and they have as much rest as they need, because not only if they don't, does that put them at risk, but it puts whatever they're hauling at risk, and it puts everybody in the neighborhood that they go through at risk.
Congresswoman, absolutely. We know that what's been going on in the industry. I can tell you that FRA is doing focused inspections is doing audits. Those are things that in the recent past, FRA had not put a lot of effort into. I reinvigorated those efforts, and we want to make sure that the railroads know that we're looking at these issues very, very closely in line with what's gone on in the recent past. We don't want to be late to this. That's why we're actively looking at these things right now and addressing them.
Well, thank you, Mr. Bose. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now hear from Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Administrator Bose, I want to read from your testimony. The mission of the Federal Railroad Administration is to enable the safe, and I'm just going to underline that, reliable and efficient movement of people and goods for a strong America now and in the future. That's a quote. And then another one, safety, including the safety of railroad employees, rail passengers, and the communities through which railroads operate, is FRA's top priority. Sound about right to you? I mean, sounds like something you'd say, and sounds like the mission that you're on, I would think.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I know that when you talked to Mr. Crawford, you didn't want to answer questions regarding a lawsuit with BNSF, but I'm going to ask you questions about Norfolk Southern, so hopefully you can answer some questions regarding automated track inspections. Are automated track inspections and manual inspections mutually exclusive? If you do one, you can't do the other?
Congressman, the answer to that's no.
Of course not, right? So you can do both. According to the testimony from Norfolk Southern, which conclusively showed that expanding the waiver would improve safety, and that also said that when the request was denied, it described the program as successful. But it seems like the key finding was ignored, that the system-wide implementation of ATGMs would improve rail and worker safety. Have you provided any rationale why the waiver was denied?
We did in the letter denying it.
Can you impart that to us now?
I'm sorry?
Can you just generalize and tell us why it was denied?
The letter said that the Railroad Safety Advisory Committee is looking at track inspections, automated track inspections in general, and that's the way that the FRA is addressing automated track inspections.
So you don't think they've been successful?
Congressman, I'm not going to get into, there's a petition for reconsideration. I want to be respectful.
I'm just asking you. I know there's a petition, but we're trying to figure out if this technology works and if it's not mutually exclusive. So Norfolk Southern, BNSF, any other railroad could implement the automated track inspection and also do manual inspections, but they're not allowed to do automated track inspection right now because it's been denied. Right, the waiver's been denied. So I would like to know why that is. If you don't think, if the FRA doesn't think that they've been successful or that they enhance or increase safety, because that's what it seems like.
Congressman, I think this is a really important point. Norfolk Southern could use automated track inspections right now. In fact, I think they are using it right now.
But they can't expand it. But they can't expand it, right?
They can expand it to other territories throughout their network.
So they haven't been denied a waiver?
Congressman, in order to use automated track inspections, they do not need a waiver in the first place.
Well, it seems like, and I said I wasn't going to ask, but I am going to ask, it seems like on the same day that they were denied, BNSF was denied to expand its pre-existing waiver to new territories. Is that not correct?
Both were denied by the safety board at the FRA. Yes, sir.
I thought you just said they weren't denied. They could expand wherever they wanted to.
Automated track inspections do not require a waiver to be in use. They are in use across railroads right now.
So why deny or not deny?
Congressman, factually, they were seeking those waivers to eliminate or reduce visual inspections.
And how do you know that?
How do I know that?
Yeah.
Because the docket that they submitted, the request that they submitted is something that's available to read.
Okay, and it says that they did it because of that.
Among other reasons, yes.
Okay, so they were going to reduce them, but were they going to stop them, visual inspections? Reduce or stop?
I don't recall exactly what they said, but it
And
was
it's
a
not
combination.
mutually exclusive, so they can do automatic track inspection and visual inspections, right?
Congressman, I'm not going to get into it because, again, there's a petition for reconsideration, there's litigation going on. I've tried to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you, and I think it was clear. Everyone in the room supports ATI, and no waiver is required to operate ATI. The next person up is the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Before I begin, Administrator Bose, would you like to take a minute of my time to expound on your answers, my colleague?
We're getting some feedback here and there. Gentlemen, can you proceed? Mm-hmm. Yeah. While we're trying to figure out what's going on with Mr. Auchincloss, we'll hear from Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I'm the 435th most powerful member of Congress, so if these questions have been asked before, I apologize. Obviously, my party has not accepted my position in leadership as I have, so I appreciate you all. I'm wondering about we all know the businesses are struggling to find workers, and I'm wondering why would the agency consider forcing small businesses to hire folks that they really don't need? And I guess that's Administrator Bose.
Congressman, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to in terms of forcing railroads to hire workers. I'm not sure if you're talking about the shortages that we've heard from the railroads directly in terms of the supply chain and the increases that they need, or if you're referring to the crew size.
I'm referring to the rule that President Biden's administration has moved forward to hire personnel or operators with more people on a train than a lot of folks feel is necessary.
Yes, sir. So when it comes to that, I'll just note this. There was a notice of proposed rulemaking back in 2016 having to do with crew size. At that time, some railroad companies had one-person crews, and there was not going to be a change to that if the railroads could provide the rationale for continuing that. And also, in terms of the crew size, right now, there's a minimum of 2 people on crews across the board at the railroad companies. So there was, in the last notice of proposed rulemaking, if it was below 2, there was an opportunity to continue that, as well as if there was 2 to maintain it. And there was also safety case that went along with those.
Okay, I'm also worried to carry that on. If the railroads can't meet some of these requirements, you think it's possible that fewer trains would run, and that would result in a worsening service and increased supply chain bottlenecks?
Congressman, when it comes to operating the trains and providing the service, I leave that to the railroads to do on their own. They're very successful businesses and have been for a long time in this country. And I think they can figure that out pretty well. But I just want to highlight, again, the Surface Transportation Board's April 27th hearing, where we did hear from customers and communities that experienced a lack of service. If there's anything that the FRA can do, the administration can do to increase the workforce for them, the railroads to increase their workers or retain workers, we're happy to work with them.
Okay, I'm just afraid that some of those mandates might carry over and more disruptions. 2 weeks ago, 24 short lines were awarded CRISI grants. And I'm wondering, how else is the Federal Railroad Administration using the CRISI grants to invest in short line upgrades and some of those safety improvements?
Yes, sir. So when it comes to short lines, FRA has a pretty robust program, but CRISI is the primary way that we fund the short lines. We also have a short line institute where we make sure that there's training and aspects of safety that we're communicating with the short lines directly. FRA also engages with the short lines throughout the year so that we can talk to them about safety and provide resources that they need. I had an opportunity to go to California, in Oakdale, California, and visit a short line company called Sierra North. And they were replacing ties, believe it or not, that were over 100 years old with the CRISI money that we gave them. So we're always looking for more opportunities. We know.
I hope it wasn't those concrete ones. I see those about behind some property I used to have. I see those. They make nice borders for gardens now. They didn't last too well. It's the good old wooden ones, I'm afraid.
Yes, sir. They're wood. They're wood.
Yes, sir. All righty. I'm about to run out of time, but I'm curious about the administration's support of funding CRISI at a higher level than its fiscal year 2023 budget. Fiscal year 2023, the Biden administration requested $1.5 billion for the grants, and it was less than $1.6 billion appropriated by Congress in fiscal year 2022. And I'm out of time. If you can just give me a quick one on that.
Yeah, we're always open to more funding for CRISI. The bipartisan infrastructure law has funding for CRISI for 5 continuous years, and that's a big deal to know that there's going to be a robust program.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back none of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Now we'll have Mr. Stauber from Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This is my question will be a follow-up with Representative Burgess, but in my home district in northeast Minnesota, we have Class 1 railroads and short lines crisscrossing the entire state. They carry the iron ore that makes 80+% of America's steel. They carry coal and other commodities and more from the West Coast and the plains through the port of Duluth. They employ hundreds of people and provide for family-supporting union jobs. Rail safety is ever present both in those communities that have rail lines running through them and the families who have parents and loved ones working on these lines. One such program that is important to rail safety is the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Grant Program, which you just talked about. Short line railroads are directly eligible for CRISI funds, and they have been successful in harnessing these resources since the program was created in 2015. And 2 weeks ago, the FRA made its latest awards, announcing 24 short lines would benefit from this program, putting investments to work to make their railroad safer by upgrading outdated track, bridges, and tunnels. These investments also make the network more efficient. Can you discuss your continued commitment toward using the CRISI program to invest in key safety goals like allowing short line freight rail to upgrade and make important repairs?
Congressman, short lines play such an important role in the railroad network that we have, and we want to do everything possible to make sure that they are robust and have the funding to make the improvements that they need. As you mentioned, the CRISI program is such a great tool to do that.
Thank you very much. And can you discuss how Chrissy more generally helps railroads improve the efficiency of the supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me point out a couple of examples. A lot of bridges are 280, or don't carry 287 pounds of capacity. So the program can be used to make those improvements. They're used to make improvements to track so that the tracks can accommodate higher speed trains. And also in terms of other infrastructure improvements, to improve grade crossings or eliminate grade crossings. That's another way that the Chrissy program is used by short line railroads.
Thank you very much. And just, I'll just end with this. I would just encourage you and the agency to continue working with our railroads that are doing improvements across our great land to make sure that the local community and the elected leaders in those areas where the improvements are going to be made are part of the conversation. And I think that's critically important. We know that you know, the railroads are help build our country, and we're upgrading the infrastructure. But I just want to make it clear to you, my recommendation is to make sure that our communities, many of them are smaller communities, that when there are upgrades, et cetera, that the administration supports working with the community leaders and such, and have an actual input on the design and be involved in the conversation. I think that would be a great help as the railroad continues to invest. So,
Absolutely, Congressman.
thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back my 1 minute and 5 seconds.
Appreciate the gentleman's consideration. And now we will have Mr. Auchincloss from Massachusetts, who's joined us.
Chairman, apologies for the audio issues. Thanks for your patience. Before I begin, Administrator Bose, if you'd like, I want to grant you a minute just to further expound on your answers with my colleague, Mr. Perry. I know you didn't have a whole lot of time to explain, but if it would be helpful to you, I want to give you that time now.
Thanks, Congressman. I was just trying to express that automated track inspection efforts don't require any sort of approval, any affirmative waivers for them to continue and be utilized on a regular basis. Railroads can use them, are using them right now without waivers.
Got it. And now, Administrator, I want to talk to you about Chrissy. Shortline Frail is critical to countless communities and economic sectors, helping industrial, manufacturing, and agricultural customers move their goods to market. The shortline freight rail industry estimates that more than $12 billion in investments are needed to ensure that the industry can modernize and meet the needs of our economy. The recently passed infrastructure law dramatically increases the level of resources available through the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Grant Program, the CRISI program. Massachusetts, the state I represent, has received nearly $35 million in CRISI awards in recent years, and another $1.75 million 2 weeks ago, putting in the investments of the infrastructure bill to work to make their railroads safer by upgrading outdated tracks, bridges, and tunnels. And these investments are also making the network more efficient. Can you discuss your commitment towards using the CRISI program to invest in key safety goals, like allowing short-line freight rail to upgrade and make important repairs?
Congressman, you have that commitment.
How can short rail also support local infrastructure improvements, many of which will use older rails to transport construction materials?
We can definitely look for projects where we can make those improvements. And we know, especially when it comes to short lines, often they don't have the resources to do the long-term improvements that are necessary. And we want to make sure the program's utilized for that purpose.
And can you also discuss how CRISI helps short-line railroads improve the efficiency of the supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. I was mentioning often, in some cases, short-line railroad bridges aren't able to carry 287 pounds of equipment, so that's one area. Also, often they need track upgrades or replace ties And the CRISI program enables, just as examples, to make those improvements. So short lines definitely utilize that program. And I also know that the short lines, relatively small grants make a huge difference to those short lines because they encompass smaller geographic areas. So we actually have a bigger impact even with the short lines. The funding goes a lot further.
Got it. Mr. Chapman, final question for you, a basic but open-ended one. What's the single most important thing we could do to improve the safety of freight rail?
Well, the emphasis that I expressed in my opening statement with respect to train approach warning, I think if we took greater advantage of the limitations available through PTC, made less use of train approach warning, I think that would have the greatest impact from our perspective, certainly with respect to safety of roadway workers.
Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Now we will have Mr. Westerman from Arizona. I'm sorry, Arkansas. I'm sorry about that. For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. My first question I want to ask Administrator Bose, and I hear that the administration is moving forward with a new rule that could require railroads to hire more personnel or to operate with more people on a train. It would be the first time in nearly the 200-year history of railroading in this country that there's been a federal rule on the number of people needed to operate a train. And if it goes forward, I'm worried about the effects on small businesses and specifically short line railroads. I have the great opportunity to represent more short line railroads in my district than any other congressional district. And instead of putting capital where it may be better used, like making improvements to track and structures that are critical for the safe and efficient movement of goods and freight, I'm concerned that they'll be asked to spend more money on unnecessary workforce expansion. Doesn't it make better sense to let small business railroads invest in their infrastructure, which allows for a safer and more efficient rail network instead of being forced to put more people on the payroll?
Congressman, thank you for that question. As you know, and I've stated before, we're working on the notice of proposed rulemaking for the crew size. What I also said earlier, and I'll highlight a part of it, is that in 2016, there was a notice of proposed rulemaking, and there were some short line railroads identified within that had less than two-person crews, one-person crews, and there was a path for them to continue utilizing one-person crews if they could make the safety case for doing that. So that was in the last notice of proposed rulemaking. Any rule that we put forward has to have a small business consideration built into it. So there will be absolutely an opportunity for comments for us to receive, to hear from the short lines and other stakeholders directly when we go forward with that. Also, as you know, there's also a cost-benefit analysis that will have to be a part of that notice of proposed rulemaking.
Thank you. In fiscal year 22, Congress provided CRISI with $1.625 billion in a mix of discretionary and mandatory spending, but in the fiscal year 23 budget request, the administration proposed $1.5 billion. Is there a reason that the administration is proposing to cut CRISI funding? I mean, I'm all for cutting costs where necessary, but I'm hoping you can tell me why they chose that program to cut and what would be cut. Congressman,
There's a lot of considerations that go into the budget proposal that we put forward. That reflects, the request reflects those trade-offs. But we know, and I'll restate this, the CRISI program has a lot of benefits. It's given a lot of benefits to short-line railroads, and I look forward to working with Congress to make sure that that program continues in a robust way.
Yeah, with all the need for investment in our infrastructure and especially on short line freight rail, it seems like it would be wise to fully unleash that potential.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I understand, and it's also important that we got the money out for fiscal year '21 that you all provided, and we did that just a few weeks ago. So it's absolutely, I hear your point on the importance of the program.
All right, thank you, Administrator. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their time today and their testimony. We find it very valuable, and we'll continue these discussions into the future. Thank you. We'll now retire this panel and ask the second panel to come up.
Thank you.
Okay, afternoon. Next, we will hear from panel 2. Before I proceed, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the Association of State Rail Safety Managers without objection. So ordered. I would like now to welcome our second panel of witnesses. Mr. Roy L. Morrison, Director of Safety, Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division, International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Don Grissom, Assistant General President of Brotherhood of Railway, Carmen Division, TCU and IAM. And Mr. Grady Cawthon, retired Transportation Policy Consultant. And Mr. Nathan Bachman, Vice President of Sales and Business Development, Lorem Technologies Incorporated. Ms. Cindy Sanborn, Chief Operating Officer, Norfolk Southern Corporation, and Chair of the Association of American Railroad Safety and Operations Management Committee. And Mr. Jeremy Ferguson, President, Sheet Metal Air Rail Transportation Division. Thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Mr. Morrison, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Payne, Ranking Member Crawford, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Roy Morrison, Director of Safety for the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division of the Teamsters. BMWD represents more than 30,000 railroad workers who do inspection, construction, maintenance, and repair of tracks, roadbeds, bridges, structures, and facilities on railroads. BMWD members have raised these issues as the most pressing. Precision scheduled railroading has produced historical record profits and historically low staffing levels in the railroad industry. Before COVID, employment on Class 1s was cut by over 30,000. And during COVID, employment has been cut by thousands more. Now, even as traffic has returned, staffing levels have not. Maintenance away employees are working over 80 to 100 hours a week doing track maintenance on multiple territories for months on end. While railroads refuse to fill open positions and continue furloughs, prior to PSR workforce cuts, BMWD commissioned an occupational safety and health research study by highly credentialed medical and academic researchers with expertise in workplace safety and health. The full study is available on BMWD's website. But the key finding of our study is that our members face significantly higher levels of disease and injury compared to workers in other industries. Severe understaffing is only making these issues worse. Additional maintenance away forces and more stable work schedules would provide some relief. With my written testimony, I've shared letters from our members about current conditions where they're pressed to cut corners, defer maintenance, skip steps, and not to work to standards they were trained to and met prior to PSR. We ask the committee to continue to stay on top of the issue and take further actions to mitigate damages caused by PSR. Starting in 2018, all the Class 1 railroads began test programs referred to as automated track inspection, but it's not new. ATI is just autonomous track geometry measurement systems, which have been in use since the 1970s, and were never designed for FRA mandated track inspections. But waivers submitted to FRA show the railroads want to cut human track inspections by up to 80%, even though there are defects the machines cannot detect. What ATI can do is identify track geometry defects, which make up about 26% of the total defects FRA requires to be inspected for. Human track inspections, taking human track inspectors off the tracks leaves 75% of track defects unmonitored. Railroads can add all the technology they want without safety waivers. The track geometry systems are already used on Amtrak at the frequencies the freight railroads have tested. Amtrak doesn't need safety waivers to do this. No railroad does. It's vital to the safety of rail employees and the public that manual in-person inspection frequencies remain at the current levels mandated by federal regulation. Recently, the AAR has complained that FRA is not rubber stamping requests to reduce human inspections. The AAR is wrong. FRA should scrutinize these waiver requests, and Congress should make it clear that the FRA has your support. I wanted to note BMWD greatly appreciates Administrator Bose. My testimony is not meant to be critical of him or the work he's doing at FRA. We're just highlighting several issues that have gone unresolved across multiple administrations. BMWD thanks the NTSB for including roadway worker safety on its agency's 21-22 most wanted list. We also ask Congress to elevate 49 CFR 214-329 from regulation to statute. The regulation requires provisions of warning equipment such as whistles, air horns, white discs, red flags, lanterns, or fusees to provide warning of oncoming trains, but the Class 1s just make roadway workers yell over the noise, and FRA has ignored our request for stricter enforcement. The punitive damage standard for retaliation against whistleblowers is the exact same as the standard to disqualify railroad managers, but our efforts to get FRA to follow through have been ignored for years. Failing to penalize managers encourages retaliatory conduct. We just ask existing regulations be enforced against bad actors. Accepted track regulations permits railroads to designate track as exempt from compliance with minimum safety requirements. It was meant to provide short-term regulatory relief 40 years ago. but railroads use it to cut costs and avoid maintenance. A 2020 NTSB report said of a worker fatality in Arlington, Texas, quote, contributing to the accident was the designation of accident track as accepted track under current FRA safety standards, which allowed inadequate track conditions to exist on track used regularly, end quote. Congress should sunset accepted track. I'd like to thank you for our opportunity to raise these concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we'll have Mr. Grissom for 5 minutes.
Chairman Payne, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Crawford, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the important issue of freight rail safety. My name is Don Grissom, and I'm a 41-year railroader, currently serving as the Assistant General President of the Brotherhood Railway Carmen, a division of Transportation Communications Union and TCU-IAM. Our members inspect, maintain, and repair rail cars on our nation railways. I'm here today to speak about the difficulty of the Carmen craft and how recent changes to the railroad business model has increased pressure from management and have created a disaster waiting to happen. First, let me emphasize that these Carmen jobs are skilled positions. Upon hiring, a Carmen apprentice spends 732 working days, 6 different 122-day phases to become a journeyman. During this time, a Carmen becomes highly skilled at inspecting and repairing rail cars. And why freight cars may appear simple, the mechanics of a freight car is quite complex and includes air brake systems, brake assemblies, wheels, draft gears, yokes, couplers, handholds, and other safety appliances, all which is required to be in working order per federal regulation for a train to operate safely. Like other crafts, Carmen have been cut to the bone in the PSR era. We have lost anywhere from 15 to 30% of our craft, depending on the railroad. And since PSR, it amounts doing less with less or moving fewer car loads with fewer employees. And the effect on the Carmen is one of the consistent and sustainable pressure on employees. Pressure not to inspect or repair rail cars. Pressure to turn a blind eye to AAR and FRA defects. Pressure to work so much forced overtime that your body becomes dangerously fatigued. This is the life of a Carmen in the PSR era. It is the only career I'm aware of where they train you to do a job and they fire you when you do it. Please remember, one defective rail car can derail an entire train. Since each car has up to 90 inspection points per car per side, or 180 in total, Carmen were allowed around 3 minutes per car on inspection. That's until the PSR era. Today, in most locations, on all the Class 1, Carmen are only allowed 1 minute for inspection, and I provided evidence in my written statement. As a result, cars often go uninspected, even if they are found defective. If the car was still rolled down the track, management tells them to send it out, regardless of whether the brake system or other critical components are in working order. All of this is due to the pressure that applied to local management and workers to do whatever it takes to get the train out. In August of 2021, the FRA performed a safety audit on the UP. Unfortunately, we heard reports that local management was given a heads up so they could sweep all the defects under the rug, and the FRA still found defective cars. We continue. We also encourage the FRA to pay special attention to yards where Carmen have been fully removed from the property. A list of those yards is included in my written statement. Finally, some attention has been paid to railroad workers on fatigue issues in the industry, but not enough. As note today, Carmen are being forced to work overtime consistently, Many reports of forced overtime include 16-hour shifts, 5 to 6 days in a row. Many of our members sleep in their cars between the shifts so they can get an extra hour or 2 hours of rest instead of wasting time commuting home and back. This is not a healthy environment. A wise colleague of mine said to me, the railroads are burning the candle at both ends. They're burning their customers on one and burning out their employees on the other. Thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have Mr. Cawthon.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss railroad safety. I'm here as an individual, having retired from FRA in 2010 after a total of 36 years in the agency, 2 decades of which were as a senior executive working on railroad safety policy issues and including a stint as Associate Administrator for Safety. I concluded my term as Deputy Associate Administrator for Safety Standards. My prepared statement provides some detail, but let me make 3 points very directly, focusing for today on the management of in-train forces. You heard Administrator Bowes refer to that, and Mr. Chapman referred to that. First, the immense progress that the railroads had made in safety over the past few decades has stalled out. Further progress has been arrested by the railroad's commitment to one form or another of so-called precision schedule railroading. One of the features that PSR has implemented has been the use of very heavy and long trains, often marshaled without adherence to train makeup principles based on research and experience. Technology has sometimes been underutilized. At other times, technology has been applied beyond its demonstrated capacity. The result has been a succession of embarrassing and dangerous accidents that need not have occurred. These are often characterized as human factor accidents, with the implication that employees just made mistakes. But for the most part, they are organizational accidents driven by management decisions. Other accidents involving management of in-train forces are being reported as equipment-related, but many equipment failures have resulted from excessive draft and buff forces in poorly assembled trains. Second, the problem will not solve itself. Investors are demanding huge payouts in the form of stock buybacks and dividends. PSR is designed to deliver cash to the bottom line. The Congress and FRA need to place countervailing pressure on the railroads through tough but flexible safety regulations. Very likely, FRA cannot do it alone, given the propensity of industry to seek shelter or just endless delay in the excruciating regulatory process and the increasingly business-friendly federal courts. Congress needs to provide direction. Third, it's important for us to raise our eyes above the current morass and consider the future of rail technology. Today's braking technology was conceived in the 1870s, and it still has inherent limitations. We need electronically controlled pneumatic brakes. ECP brakes were developed by the AAR and suppliers in the 1990s. They were authorized for use in selected revenue service under waivers that I signed, and then they were authorized and incentivized by regulations that we issued in 2007. At that point, the momentum died. When FRA and PHMSA tried to apply ECP brakes to high-hazard unit trains, the railroads fought it, even though most of the costs would have been paid by shippers and most of the benefits would have flowed to the railroads. We need a legislative mandate for FRA to move forward with the phased implementation of ECP brakes. The railroads will not protect their own future so long as the goal is short-term profitability. This is the fact. When lavish returns on investment will not be realized within the tenure of current railroad managements, investment will be deferred. Positive train control took a legislative mandate and 35 years to get done. In the case of ECP brakes, progress has already been deferred for over 2 decades. Mr. Chairman, to provide a better explanation of this complex topic, I provided the committee, in addition to my prepared statement, with my white paper on management of in-train forces, which is now in its 3rd revision. It could also be found at the Railway Age website. I look forward to any questions the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now we'll have Mr. Bachman for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Payne, Ranking Member Crawford, and members of this esteemed subcommittee. My name is Nate Bachman, and I am the Vice President of Sales and Business Development at Loram Technologies, Inc., LTI. Based out of Georgetown, Texas, we are a division of Loram Maintenance of Way. In addition, I serve on the Executive Committee as the Secretary-Treasurer of Railway Engineering Maintenance Suppliers Association, REMSA, a national trade association that represents companies that manufacture rail maintenance of way equipment and provide related services. I am honored to join this distinguished panel today and to provide our perspective on the important topic of freight rail safety. I'll first begin by commending Congress for the passing of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The IIJA provides visionary and unprecedented levels of funding for key rail safety programs. While Loram Technologies is just one business within REMSA, the rail supply segment of the industry has a significant economic footprint. Railway suppliers directly employ more than 125,000 people in manufacturing, repair, maintenance, and leasing, among others. In addition to my role on the REMSA board, LTI is also a proud and active member of the National Railroad Construction and Maintenance Association, the NRC, and the American Association of Railroads. Both at LTI specifically and in the entire rail supply and contracting industry, safety is our #1 priority. We work as a company and industry to continually improve safety performance. In our experience, the most successful work environment is one where technology, such as automated track inspection, can complement the work on the ground to both augment and improve safety for workers and the railroads. That is precisely what this technology does today. To be clear, the intent of this technology is not to replace workers. Before LTI and other companies developed these solutions, track inspections were both labor and time intensive. This technology can detect tiny defects invisible to the human eye while enabling railroads to inspect up to 8 times as much track in a given day. By targeting visual inspections through the use of data-driven technology, we can reduce redundant manual inspections, which both enhances greater roadway worker safety and allows for an approach whereby track workers' inspection time can be dedicated to and prioritized around the most pressing track defects. Loram Technologies utilizes proprietary state-of-the-art imaging technology which scans the track to reveal the exact condition of every railroad tie and the associated components along the way. It pinpoints any potential problems and marks their exact location so that the railroad can target and repair them in an efficient manner. This technology finds flaws manual detection methods may miss, and it does so while traveling at speeds up to 25 miles per hour. According to the FRA, track-related issues caused 1/4 to 1/3 of all train accidents from 2001 to 2020. The use of automated track inspection technologies paired with visual inspections has helped to drive down this number considerably. We encourage Congress and the FRA to work collaboratively to promote rail technologies that enhance safety in the industry. We believe that the waivers that the Class 1 railroads have requested for continuing their ATI pilot programs put safety first and should be continued. More data from continued pilots benefits rail workers, rail suppliers, railroads, the FRA, and the general public. This combination of data-driven findings from ATI technology and the visual inspections made by workers on the ground should be a powerful force in moving the rail industry forward. Thank you for the opportunity to share our perspective, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, sir. And next, we will hear from Ms. Sanborn.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Norfolk Southern and the approximately 630 other freight railroads operating in the United States form an integrated system that provides the world's safest, most productive, and lowest cost freight rail service. The U.S. freight railroad industry is an irreplaceable national asset that enhances our nation's standard of living and its competitiveness in the tough global economy. The U.S. rail system owes its success to a lot of different factors, but in my opinion, a key ingredient is our dedicated workforce. Railroading is a tough, demanding job. The men and women of Norfolk Southern put their boots on every day and work hard to safely and efficiently serve our customers. It's no exaggeration to say that the railroad couldn't operate without them, and I'm grateful that they have chosen to pursue a career in this important industry. In railroading, the relentless pursuit of safe operations is not optional. It's a business imperative. We have an obligation to operate safely for the benefit of our employees, our customers, and the communities where we operate. And while we have not yet reached our ultimate goal of 0 accidents and injuries, we are making significant progress. The overall train accident rate, the employee injury rate, and grade crossing collision rate have all fallen substantially since the year 2000. Railroads today have lower employee injury rates than most other major industries, including trucking, airlines, agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and construction, even lower than grocery stores. These results are driven by the industry's sustained investment in its infrastructure, the development of safety technologies, and the modernization of operating and maintenance practices. But the most important factor in achieving continuous safety improvement is the creation of a company culture that promotes safety through behavioral changes. Railroads work very hard to train their employees and instill in them a high level of safety awareness in everything they do. We are among the nation's most frequent recruiters of veterans whose discipline and training are a good fit within a high-performing safety culture. The federal government can also have significant impact on the freight transportation sector's ability to achieve positive safety outcomes. It is essential that when the government enacts laws or regulation, it keeps in mind the impact on safety of the nation's entire transportation system. Taking an evidence-based, holistic view of the whole transportation ecosystem is vitally important to creating national safe transportation policy that works for all stakeholders and delivers continuous improvements in safety. Regulation of crew size is a subject where I think the federal government would benefit from taking this approach. Legislation and regulations have been considered that would mandate that all Class I freight trains must operate with 2 employees in the locomotive cab. Yet there is no evidence that trains with 1-person crews have accidents at a higher rate than trains with 2-person crews. While it wouldn't enhance safety, there is one thing a crew size regulation would accomplish. It would make railroading less competitive against other modes of transportation who do not face similar operational restrictions. Imposing a minimum crew size mandate on railroads would undermine the policy goals of promoting safer, more environmentally sustainable freight transportation. The federal government also has an important role to play in encouraging, or at least not discouraging, the development of safety-enhancing technology. One recent technological innovation with demonstrated safety benefits is automated track inspection technology. In cooperation with FRA, we developed a test to find the optimal mix of automated and manual track inspections. On every single metric tested, the automated system increased track safety and quality, even as the frequency of manual inspections was reduced. This system was able to detect defects that were imperceptible under visual inspection, while human inspectors were able to concentrate on making track repairs and finding defects in switches, crossing diamonds, and other areas that the automated system could not evaluate. Despite these impressive results, the FRA recently denied our request for a waiver that would have allowed the same combination of automated and manual inspections everywhere on Norfolk Southern system. At NS, our goal is to provide a customer experience that is safe, efficient, and as cost-effective as possible. But this can't happen without technology. We are concerned that FRA is not doing everything it can to support the development of technologies such as automated track inspection systems that have actually been shown to work. We respectfully urge policymakers at all levels to be proactive, collaborative partners with railroads to meet our ultimate goal of 0 accidents and injuries. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I'll be glad to take your questions.
Thank you. Now we'll hear from Mr. Ferguson for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Payne, Ranking Member Crawford, and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to testify. I took office in October of 2019. In my first 15 months as president, there were 12 rail transportation worker fatalities. In fact, at one point, within that period, the railroad suffered a fatality and at least 1 amputation every month for 9 months straight. Today, very little has changed for the better. Undoubtedly, the railroads will have a message of an industry on the mend, but please be rest assured that nothing can be further from the truth. For the last 10 years, the railroads have averaged 8 fatalities per year. Last year, there were 9, and while there may be brief lulls of those types of events, the data reveals a steady, consistent, and frightening trend. Currently, the rail carriers are hell-bent on risking further injury to their employees, as well as the American public and supply chain infrastructure by reducing or eliminating altogether the 2 crew members that control train movement in the cab of a locomotive. They will tell you that it is a matter of collective bargaining and that there is no data to support otherwise. I say to you, please do not be swayed. Safety is not, nor should it ever be, negotiable. I assure you, accidents are occurring on short lines and yard jobs that operate with less than a 2-person crew, but the rates and/or trends cannot be identified because the information is not captured. Similarly, all Class 1s over-the-road railroad operations are performed with no less than a 2-person crew today, so there is no other data to compare. In other words, the railroads have no idea what will happen if they reduce crew size, but it's a gamble they're willing to take for the sake of satisfying their insatiable appetite of improving their company's bottom line. What we do know from the data that we do have is that things are getting worse. A quick look at years 2020 through 2021 reveal an increase in total accidents and incidents from 8,792 to 9,192, and an increase in total employee injuries from 2,961 to 3,054. Make no mistake, it's railroad greed that I believe has caused this committee to call us here today. As you are aware, PSR was born from the pressure put forth by investors and shareholders on Wall Street. Since its advent, dramatic, haphazard cuts have decimated railroad resources. Approximately 33% of the Class 1 workforce was laid off more than a year before the first case of COVID had ever been identified. Locomotives were put in storage, and integral crafts with special skills that were relied upon to perform safety-critical inspections were eliminated from terminals across the country. Looking to the future, the trajectory for rail safety is alarming, especially if PSR continues with its status quo. Employees fortunate enough to have not been affected by the cuts are now voluntarily walking away from what was once the premier blue-collar job in the nation. As a result, the institutional knowledge the carriers are letting walk out the door will threaten rail safety for another generation to come. Exasperating this issue is the railroad's panic-driven effort to stop the PR nightmare they are currently facing for their majority contribution to the supply chain crisis. Included in this panic is the slashing of training programs for new hires so that the railroads can portray an improving number of workers, when in reality, all they are actually doing is providing the trainees with a deficient training program and a foundation built for failure. This is evidenced by multiple amputations and crushing injuries recently occurring to newly promoted conductors. Notably, FRA accident report measurements do not reflect amputations. They are reported the same as most any other injury. This needs to change. Also, a specialized study of the dangers in switching operations is warranted by the NTSB. The NTSB has never performed one of those specialized studies on switching operations, and now is the time, as most fatalities and amputations have occurred in the performance of switching operations. Compounding troubles in the rail industry is the fact that train lengths are growing, and so are the number of major derailments, each one another step closer to the inevitability of the big one. Also increasing are the number of block crossings, the outcry from public commuters, and the stories of first responders not being able to get to their destinations, while the victims, dependent upon their timely response, perish on the other side of the train. Long trains are also making very difficult work for the crews. Radio communications are insufficient for the lengths of the trains. Conductors and engineers regularly lose the ability to communicate, often stranding them from a cry for help or a much-needed train movement instruction to ensure the safest course. Long trains also expose our members to the elements for periods of time that would be unacceptable by OSHA and other industries, but somehow are permissible in rail.
Please wrap up.
In closing, I would like to say this. I am on record as having said that the railroad industry is going to end up like Boeing. It's not just the accidents that I'm referring to. It's a lack of oversight and concern for the railroad's constant capitulation to outside pressures that are creating the biggest dangers. I am not sounding the alarm here. I am screaming into the bullhorn for help. If left unchecked, it's my members who will end up maimed or killed, and it is America whose supply chain will end up collapsed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Okay. We'll move now on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I'll start by recognizing myself. Mr. Morrison, have your members identified defects that were missed by automated track inspection technology inspecting the same track? And can you share an example?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. Yes, my members have identified multiple defects that were missed by the track geometry measurement technology. Several examples exist, and I could get your office a list later, but I have examples of broken rails, stripped joints, where the joints rip completely out and it's discontinuance in the rail, just like a broken rail. Tie defects, crossings that were where the train was coming in contact with the crossing. We provided several examples in our lawsuit with BNSF in 2018, and I can provide you with as many more as you want.
Thank you. Mr. Grissom, what are the effects of allowing Carmen only 1/3 of the usual time to inspect rail cars?
Employees are pressured to rush the inspection and they're not doing a proper inspection on the cars or repairs. When you inspect it, you might have to change a brake shoe or go underneath, check the side bearing clearance or clearance on the center plate. And this isn't being allowed because of the pressure from management to get the cars out, to get the train out, to keep everything on schedule. There's not enough time or employees allowed to properly inspect the freight trains.
Mr. Ferguson, what are the safety reasons that two-person crews are the industry standard on Class 1 freight trains?
Well, thank you for the question, sir. Safety reasons are endless. 2 sets of eyes on the capital locomotive is paramount for the safety of our communities that we operate under. It keeps the trains moving, which helps our supply chain, and of course, it keeps fellow employees safe at all given times.
Thank you. With that, I will yield back and recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me, I want to direct this question to Mr. Bachman. How has automated track inspection technology improved freight rail safety, and how can it be used to help not only in basic safety inspections, but also in potentially identifying security threats to our freight rail network?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. Where automated track inspection has benefited the industry, specifically in our case, we've been able, over the last decade plus, been able to collect copious amounts of data over nearly 500,000 miles worth of track. And it's the collection of this data and really understanding what the conditions are on the ground that have allowed us to provide metrics to our customers, the railroads, where they can go out and identify specific areas that need the greatest amount of attention and allocate their resources to address those areas that have the most pressing needs. In terms of the overall safety of the railroads, we're of the mind that by going out and collecting track and identifying tie condition really across the country, We have been able to get a better understanding of overall tie condition, how ties exist in different environments, and that has really allowed the railroads the opportunity to plan better, to plan smarter, and produce an overall greater quality product. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the response. And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. And now we have Mr. Moulton from Massachusetts for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, after reading all of your testimonies from 4 of you, Mr. Morrison, Mr. Grissom, Mr. Ferguson, Mr. Cawthon, gentlemen, all of you directly called out PSR, Precision Scheduled Railroading, for its deleterious effects on service and drastic cuts to vital personnel. I mean, there's not a single piece of testimony that notes any benefit to PCR whatsoever, which for all intents and purposes appears to strictly benefit the Wall Street shareholders whose pockets are being padded by this change. So for all of you, how have we assembled a panel of industry experts here today, and not a single one of you stands by arguably the biggest labor and financial decision implemented in freight rail in the past quarter century? How did we end up here? How do we end up here, and how do we get out of this mess and return to a functional system that prioritizes service capacity and safety and actually grows volume, actually has customers saying, I want to switch from truck to rail, because not only is it better for the rest of America to get these trucks off the highway, but the railways are actually offering better service. How do we get there?
Congressman Moulton, thank you for the question. I'll start. This is Cindy Sanborn from Norfolk Southern and representing AAR as well. I have to tell you that in my mind, PSR is a catchphrase for things people don't like about what's going on the railroad. I have to tell you that at Norfolk Southern, we implemented the basic principles of PSR in 2019, and those basic principles are about turning assets, turning rail cars, and not switching them as many places if we don't need to benefit our customers. And as we implemented it in 2019, we actually saw our service being extremely strong, some of the best we've had in many, many years. And then what we found was if we weren't switching cars as many places, and we had the technology of distributed power and more technology on our locomotives than we've had in years, the upgrades the capability of the tractive effort of the locomotives that allowed us to build longer trains. And those two things together allowed us to not need as many people to operate, whether it was train crews or, in fact, we shed about 400 locomotives at Norfolk Southern, so we didn't need as many people to work on locomotives. And then we hit a pandemic. And going into the pandemic, we saw complete industries, think about the automobile industry that went completely to no production whatsoever. We served that both on the outbound side of finished automobiles and the inbound side on metals and plastics going into making those automobiles. And so then we furloughed as a result of that change in demand. And as we've come out of the pandemic, as we all know, the labor market has changed substantially in terms of the amount of people looking for work versus the number of jobs that are needed. And as I mentioned, our employees got us through the pandemic, and they have worked tirelessly and very, 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 very diligently. And we are hiring very aggressively to help solve these service issues because we want to grow our business.
Sanborn, look, employees have a tough job. I've worked on a railroad track crew before. It's technical work. It's often backbreaking work. They need to know the details of that job. And yet the STB issued an order criticizing Norfolk Southern for a disturbing lack of detail about your plans to improve service, including how many people NS will hire and how you'll do it. I mean, these are obviously challenges. I get it. You're facing challenges. But your employees are doing great work. They're putting it in every day. How come you can't even come up with a detailed plan for how you're going to fix this problem?
Our discussions, our information we provided to the STB was around our hiring plans. And if you look at our geography, we have 95 hiring locations. If we gave a total number of how many people we wanted to hire, if we didn't have them in the right physical locations, in other words, you could hit that target number, but still not have the right people spread across the different locations, we still wouldn't see service improve. So trying to answer the question is extremely difficult, but rest assured we have substantial plans and are recruiting very, very diligently. Some locations we're hiring where we have very little difficulty sourcing employees, and some places the job market is extremely, extremely tight, and we are having challenges.
What are you doing? What are you doing to address derailments and the fact that these long trains break into much more frequently than shorter trains? And the fact that you don't even have sidings to hold these long trains. The yards can't handle them. So cars will wait for days just waiting for a long train because you don't have the locomotives, you don't have the personnel to operate these trains. And then you finally get that train over the road, it breaks in half. And when you finally get it back together and get it to a yard, the yard can't even receive it.
Well, thanks for
I mean, tell me that's not a mess.
Thanks for your question. I in the limited time here, and in the sake of brevity, I'll tell you that if we had to run more trains, we would need even more people than we need today. And running longer trains is allowing us to more efficiently move what we can move and safely. I do not think the evidence supports that longer trains drive derailments.
Gentlemen's
Well,
time.
I would like to look into that further, Mr. Chairman. I hope we can examine that last question further, because I think the exact opposite, that we're seeing more derailments, more train breaks because they are so long. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I would be glad to communicate specifically with you about that if you have specific questions.
Thank you, and I concur with.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I concur with the gentleman from Massachusetts. Next, we will hear from Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question for Mr. Grissom. How seriously do you think that railroads take fatigue as a safety issue, and how do you think the FRA's new fatigue rule would change things?
For the first part of your question, the railroads are not, I don't believe, is taking fatigue at all serious. Let me give you an example on CSX. We have a form called PI-82 where the employees can report unsafe condition. Our members were turning in these PI-82s when they're forced to work 16 hours or even beyond 16 hours. They were telling their managers they were fatigued, they can't even stay awake, they can't perform their job safely. And the managers refused to accept these PI-82s unsafe condition forms. They clearly stated that these are not a safety concern. This is not part of their safety program. And this is what they're continuously telling our members. This just happened on Monday, right when the fatigue report came out. And I can tell you CSX, for one carrier, is not taking it safely. The only thing they get their attention is if it affects their profit. If you hit them in their pocketbook, that's what they take serious. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So a question for Mr. Ferguson. You mentioned in your testimony that radio communication failures are regularly occurring because of the growing lengths of trains. Can you expand on that and also address the real life issues that this creates for a conductor and an engineer? And also, what would happen if this were to occur while the train was blocking a crossing and a crew was unable to communicate?
Yes, Mr. Congressman, thank you. That's an excellent question, and it happens every day out here across all Class 1 railroads that are dealing with extremely long trains. For instance, I just got a report a few minutes ago. There's a train operating across the state of Missouri that's just over 21,000 foot long. So that's 3 of our typical trains, let's just say 3 times 7,000, right? So when you're trying to put that train together, or you have a crossing that you have to cut, and that means separate the railroad cars that are blocking the highway grade crossing, the conductor has to communicate with the head end where the engineer is to move the cars and the train back and forth to get everything situated. And the radios that we're carrying as trainmen, as conductors, can't stretch over 2 miles in most instances, and some even less, depending on what the weather and the other atmospheric conditions are. So that creates a very unsafe condition. And if you get the equipment moving and then you need to stop it suddenly, you can't get that message relayed to the head end. If you're in a yard operation, management will tell our crews to have somebody relay it, have a yard master relay it. Everybody's too busy, there's too much radio chatter going on, there's too many other things that are interfering with the safe operation of that specific move, and it can become very catastrophic very quickly, especially if the train is 3 to 4 miles long. That is insanity. So it jeopardizes not only our safety, but the communities that we have to operate through, and when we're stopped and we have to separate equipment across grade crossings.
Okay, thank you. And just a rapid fire question to Mr. Grissom, Mr. Ferguson, Mr. Morrison. Each of you mentioned important outstanding safety issues that need to be addressed by the FRA. What is something that the FRA can do to address a concern you raise in your testimony? In real brief, please.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I'd like to start if it's possible. As we said, I'd say the biggest thing that FRA could do is start enforcing the regulations on manager disqualification for knowingly violating whistleblower protections. We've been asking the FRA to look at those regulations and implement them in an industry that is known for its retaliatory behavior and making it hard on workers. If
Thank
that
you.
were,
Anyone else? Because my time's almost up.
Yeah, I'd like to add, just to have the FRA show up more and enforce the regulations and don't tip off management before they come on the property, so they get a true picture of what's the day-to-day operation.
Thank you, sir. And I think my time is up. So, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Tim. His time has expired. Now we have the gentlelady from California, Ms. Napolitano, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with my the comments from my colleagues on the length of the trains, because that's one issue that I've had along in my area. But Ms. Sanborn, I've been long concerned about grade crossing safety and block crossings. The statement from the Association of State Railroad Safety Managers describes the harmful safety impact of block crossings. But they also say some railroads are requiring local municipalities to pay maintenance fees for various grade crossing improvement projects, resulting in delay, canceling, or scaling back a project intended to enhance grade crossing safety. These maintenance fees have long been paid for by the railroads, but now, shortly after Congress made available billions in grants to support grade crossing improvement projects, railroads are trying to pass the buck. We should be working together to improve the grade crossing safety, not creating more obstacles. And why are the railroads now having governments paying for these maintenance fees? And can your company and AAR look into this and please reverse the trend?
I'm sorry, I could not quite understand what you were saying. If somebody else did, I'm happy to hear them help me understand better what you just asked me. I just couldn't hear you.
Well, it has to do with the rail crossings and the grade crossing improvements. Prior to this, the railroads took care of it, the maintenance fees, and now they're asking the communities to pay for it. But shortly after, Congress made available billions in grants to support them. And why are the railroads now having governments pay for these maintenance fees? And can your company and AAR look into it and please reverse the trend?
Yeah, so as far as road crossing maintenance fees, we pay for the operation of the crossing once it's installed. And if there's some specific questions that you have, Congresswoman Napolitano, I'll be happy to look further. I'm not that conversant on the issue that you're bringing up specifically, but we'll get back to you with an answer.
Well, there certainly is a problem, and I agree with my colleagues' comments that the railroads are making profits for Wall Street, and the communities are suffering. And we need to be sure that we back the employees, because and as far as the whistleblowers are concerned, maybe we should make more availability to them to tell us what is going wrong so we can take action. And I know that the railroads have autonomy over much of what happens on the land, but it's important that we provide more safety for the employees. I know in my area, there are many employees of the railroad, and sometimes they come to me with some of the issues that they feel are important for their safety, but we don't have enough input to be able to take action on them.
To your point, I would agree that, and involve myself in listening to employees. In fact, in the last 30 days, I've been in Roanoke, Virginia, Cincinnati, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I'll be in the yard in Atlanta here on Thursday, and listening to our employees and what they have to say around safety and concerns that they have. I think that there's general frustration that they would like to see the railroad operate better. They feel better when the railroad operates better, and we absolutely want to do that, both from a safety perspective and serving our customers as well. I would also say that, you know, part of the solution is hiring, and we are very aggressively hiring and need our existing employees that are working the jobs today to help train new employees. And this is across all crafts. This is not just T&E. And to your point around, you know, crossings and paying for things, I think I'd like to make this point. You know, we compete across many areas. We compete in service. There are alternatives to using our service. We compete in terms of cost to be able to be the most efficient and effective as we can so we can charge a reasonable price for our service. And we compete from the standpoint of capital markets and having access to those capital markets by having shareholders buy our stock. So, and all three areas are very important areas for us to be effective and efficient and serve our customers, with the overall umbrella constantly being safety. And we want to grow our business. We feel that we're very climate friendly. We know we're very climate friendly. We offer our customers an opportunity to reduce their carbon footprint. And only can we do that if we're able to provide a very, very good service. And it takes our employees to do that. If it weren't for them, we would not have a business. So I think we are aligned in many areas. I think frustrations might exist as well. But thank you for your questions.
I'd like to be able to connect with you later because there are many other points that I'd like to bring forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. We'll now have the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing, and thank the second panel of witnesses for your testimony today. Workforce cuts by Class 1 railroads have decimated their workforces by a third of their size since 2015. And what's especially shocking is that this cutting of the labor force predates the pandemic. To date, rail companies have failed to rehire previously furloughed workers, leading to labor shortages on many rail lines. Mr. Grissom and Mr. Morrison, do you think harsh and unduly challenging working conditions play a role in workers deciding not to return to the workforce, such as forced overtime, heavier workloads, and management pressure to circumvent safety?
Yes, thank you for the question, and you are correct. We saw this problem before the pandemic, and one of the issues is the railroads, they'll furlough somebody, they'll be furloughed for a year or two, call them back, they may work another year or two, then get laid off again. And people are just sick and tired of being a part-time employee, and they're just in dilemma during the part of the furlough. And so you're right about the conditions and the intimidation and not being respected as an employee at work. This is what we're hearing from our members, and we're seeing employees with 20, 25 years into the rail retirement system, and we got a unique rail retirement system where you can have 30 years at age 60 and fully retire. And we're seeing people with 20, 25 years of service walking off the job.
And they're not coming back because of the work conditions that are in existence at this time. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, it's just they don't feel safe at work. They just don't feel like they're taking safety serious. The fatigue.
Okay, thank you. All right, and Mr. Morrison, what do you think about it?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congressman. This is a great topic. Yeah, the conditions our members are being forced to work in right now are just catastrophic. And And a lot of them, yes, the work is hard, and yes, it's taxing on our members and it's taking physical tolls, but also our members are very professional in what they do. And we have members also walking away from the industry because of what they see this automated track inspection is doing. They don't feel safe as a track inspector, and they don't feel that the railroads are giving them the tools that they need to keep that railroad track safe. So,
well, let me ask you this question. What types of changes to working conditions would be needed to encourage workers to remain on the job or return to the job?
So for the maintenance of way employees, I mean, yes, hiring and getting more people out there is absolutely critical. Now, the railroads don't value their employees like they say they do. They're not. We're in negotiations right now, so they're not really keeping the industry as good of a job as it used to be, and it's a highly hostile workforce. You know, it's the only industry I know of where our members actually purchase insurance for when they get fired to help get them through the process of going through the investigation and to try to get back, which might take up to 2 years.
Yeah, let me ask this question, Ms. Sanborn. In recent years, trains have been growing consistently longer, with lengths now reaching more than 3 miles. What factors, Ms. Sanborn, are evaluated when determining how long a train should be? And would you agree that the decision-making process is primarily driven by cost factors rather than safety?
I will tell you that our decisions around train size and how we plan for that are created on needs of service for our customers and how can we move that freight most efficiently. And train size does play a factor in it, but in any time we operate a train of a different type or longer train on a geography that we haven't before, we do simulations to ensure that it can be done safely.
Well, you're trying to get as much money as you can out of each shipment, and so that's why train lengths have gotten longer. Isn't that correct?
As like I mentioned before, just real briefly, we compete in service, we compete in cost to make an effective service, to be able to charge a decent price. So there are a number of reasons that we get the benefits of longer trains and can then handle more business because we compete more effectively in that way.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time.
I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. We're next here from the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. As we begin to inject billions into our nation's infrastructure, including, of course, rail, no project will be able to get off the ground without a workforce. Railroading is a 24/7 operation, frequently requiring odd working hours and unpredictable schedules. The average total number of workers employed by the Class I railroads at the end of 2021 was nearly 1/3 less than the total employed in 2015, according to data reported by the railroads and published by the Surface Transportation Board. For both Mr. Ferguson and Mr. Grissom, you've testified that workers are leaving the industry because of worsening conditions on the job. As workers leave the railroads and aren't being replaced by new hires, what effect is that having on the workload for the people still there? And Mr. Ferguson, you can begin.
Yes, Mr. Congressman, thank you. What it's doing to the existing workforce is basically unbearable. They put forth these draconian attendance policies. They want more out of the workforce they have today, and it's making their family life, their work life, every part of it unbearable because they're so short-handed. If you are home, if you are fortunate enough to get time with your family, the phone is constantly ringing once you become rested under the hours of service. They don't have enough people to adequately staff the other trains that you're technically not responsible for, so they're going to constantly ring your phone. That may be in the middle of the night while you're trying to get sleep for when you're going to go to work on your regular scheduled job.
And then jumping in there for Mr. Grissom, to that point, are workers being expected to take on more shifts and potentially work while fatigued or in unsafe conditions?
Yes, they're required to stay over. So we normally, like you said, we're 24/7, 3 shifts, first, second, third shift. So if you're working second shift from 3 to 11, you're thinking you're going to get off 11 o'clock tonight. But if there's not enough people for third shift, you're going to be forced, it's a requirement, you're going to stay over and perform another shift. So you're going to be there 16 hours. And when you get there, you don't know if you're going to work 8 hours or 16 hours or 24 hours or when you're going to get home. And you don't know how to pack a lunch because you can't leave the property to, go through McDonald's drive-through. You're stuck on that property with no food. That's another issue we have.
Understood. And switching gears to Mr. Cawthon, your testimony describes a regression in the management of in-train forces, identifying 5 types of recurring incidents that demonstrate the problem: improperly sequencing cars within a train, lack of appropriate locomotive power, brake lines that are too long to function properly, failure to account for possible loss of communication throughout a train, and relying on onboard systems inappropriately. If in-train forces is as old as railroading, why are these problems happening?
Well, I try not to go to head-to-head with the railroad operating officer because they're pretty tough and very knowledgeable. But the fact of the matter is that, number one, traditionally this was a matter handled by the railroads themselves and pretty well. There were still lapses, and then the railroad would report. The train makeup was the cause of the accident. And indeed, we're still getting reports of train makeup as cause of the accident. Sometimes it's improper use of dynamic brakes, but the underlying cause is the train was not manageable by the crew, given its composition. The more you take a block of cars and add another block of cars sequentially at different locations to aggregate the cars into the most efficient train, the less likely it is that train is going to be made up correctly in terms of the management of in-train forces, and that's what's going on.
Mr. Cawthon, I'm gonna interject there. Thank you for the response. I do want to give Ms. Sanborn the final minute just to respond to the comments thus far.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Let me talk about in-train forces. We have a lot of technology has come along that has been very beneficial to us to handle longer trains very efficiently and safely. Distributed power is an example of that. Energy management systems that are basically cruise control systems that help operate the train with an eye towards managing in-train forces as well as speed and fuel efficiency. And I would tell you that we have operating rules that give us and have a very clear understanding of trailing tonnage and specifics around how the train is made up, whether there's end-of-car cushioning devices.
But these accidents are still happening. They're still happening.
What's happening?
The accidents are still happening at an increasing rate, and so it calls into question the new technologies and their efficacy to the problems at hand.
I think the technology is enhancing our operation to make it more safe, and I think the technology will continue to do that, both from a standpoint of train build and train marshaling, and we are continuing to improve in the visibility of that for not just the next station, but the entire route of the train.
Yielding back, Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. That concludes our hearing for today. I would like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony today. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. The subcommittee stands adjourned.